Montana Territory, 1872. The first rays of dawn crept over the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains, illuminating the bustling main street of Silver Creek. Horses snorted impatiently at hitching posts while shopkeepers swept their boardwalks, preparing for another day of commerce in a town that had sprung up almost overnight when silver was discovered in the nearby hills. The frontier was still raw here, a place where fortunes could be made and lost between sunrise and sunset, where the line between civilization and wilderness remained paper-thin. 19-year-old Nora McIntosh stood on the balcony of her father's grand house overlooking the town, her honey-blonde hair catching the morning light as she tightened her grip on the railing. The blue silk of her carefully tailored dress rustled in the mountain breeze. Below her, Silver Creek was awakening to another day of possibility, but Nora felt only the walls closing in around her. "A lady of your standing has responsibilities," her father's words from the previous night's argument echoed in her mind. "You cannot continue to reject every suitable gentleman who comes calling. The Prescott boy has prospects, connections." Nora's jaw tightened. She had survived the journey west, nursed her ailing mother until the consumption finally took her, and helped her father establish his mercantile empire in 3 different boom towns. Yet still, at 19, she was viewed as nothing more than a prize to be bartered away in marriage to secure business alliances. The frontier had taught Nora one unassailable truth. In this harsh land, allowing yourself to depend on others was a weakness you couldn't afford. Love was a luxury that withered in the face of frontier hardship. Her mother had loved deeply and died broken-hearted when her father's ambition repeatedly uprooted them. Friends she'd made in each new settlement had quickly forgotten her once she moved on. Even the servants her father hired disappeared into the night when better prospects arose. "Miss Nora," the housekeeper's voice called from inside, "your father requests your presence for breakfast with Mr. Prescott and his son." Nora closed her eyes briefly, steeling herself. She had survived this long by being practical, by understanding that in the West, sentimentality was a quick path to ruin. She didn't need love. She needed security, and if that meant entertaining Bartholomew Prescott's tedious conversation about his father's banking investments, so be it. What she needed was a plan, one that would ensure her independence in a world determined to deny it to her. Little did Nora know that by sunset, her carefully ordered world would be upended by a man the town barely noticed, a man whose quiet presence concealed secrets that would challenge everything she believed about survival on the frontier. Dust swirled around the hooves of Drew Ramsey's chestnut mare as he guided her down Silver Creek's main street later that same morning. At 25, Drew carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd spent most of his life in the embrace of the mountains rather than the confines of towns. His face was clean-shaven but weather-tanned, with strong features framed by dark brown hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. Though lean from a life of physical labor, his shoulders were broad beneath the simple buckskin jacket he wore. Drew nodded politely to the townspeople who bothered to acknowledge him, though most simply dismissed him with a glance. To them, he was just another mountain man who occasionally came to town for supplies, hardly worth noting in a place where silver barons and cattle kings commanded attention and respect. He tied his horse outside the mercantile and paused, steeling himself for the noise and confinement of the town's largest store. The mountains had been his home since he was 12, when his parents died of fever and his uncle took him in, teaching him the ways of hunting, trapping, and reading the land. The old man had passed 3 winters ago, leaving Drew alone but self-sufficient in their remote cabin. Drew believed in the solitary life. The mountains were honest in their dangers, unlike people who smiled while reaching for your purse. In the wilderness, a man needed only his wits, his strength, and his knowledge to survive. Towns like Silver Creek were necessary evils, places to trade furs and gold dust for supplies before returning to the clean air and open spaces where a man could breathe. What brought him to town today wasn't just the dwindling supply of coffee and ammunition at his cabin. 2 days ago, while hunting in a remote canyon, he'd found something that had kept him awake these past nights, something that might change everything if he could find the right person to help him make sense of it. The bell above the mercantile door jangled as Drew stepped inside, squinting as his eyes adjusted to the relative darkness. The store was crowded with mining equipment, barrels of dried goods, rolls of fabric, and glass cases displaying more expensive wares. A cluster of well-dressed men stood near the counter, their laughter cutting through the murmur of other customers. "I tell you, Macintosh, that vein we hit yesterday could be the mother lode we've been searching for," one of them said, slapping the shoulder of a distinguished older gentleman in an expensive suit. "You should reconsider my offer to buy into the operation." "Perhaps, Prescott," the older man replied, "though I prefer ventures with fewer variables." Drew kept his head down, moving through the store with practiced efficiency, gathering only what he needed. He'd nearly completed his shopping when raised voices drew his attention. "I've told you before, I'm not interested in your attention, Mr. Prescott." A woman's voice, clear and controlled but with unmistakable tension. "Now, Miss McIntosh, you're being unreasonable. A lady in your position should be flattered by my interest." The voice belonged to a young man about Drew's age, though the resemblance ended there. Where Drew was lean and hardened by mountain living, this man was soft around the edges, his clothes finely tailored, his hands uncalloused. Drew rounded a display of canned goods to see a young woman backed against a shelf of fabric bolts, her honey-blonde hair arranged in an elaborate style that somehow managed to look both elegant and slightly rebellious. Her blue dress was clearly expensive, but it was her expression that caught Drew's attention, a mixture of anger and resignation, as though she were fighting a battle she'd fought many times before. "I believe the lady expressed her wishes clearly," Drew found himself saying, the words leaving his mouth before he'd fully considered them. The young woman's eyes, a startling shade of hazel, widened in surprise as they shifted to him. The well-dressed man turned, his face flushing with indignation. "This is a private conversation, mountain man," he sneered, looking Drew up and down. "Mind your own business." Drew didn't move. When a gentleman continues to impose his company after a lady has declined it, it becomes everyone's business. "Do you have any idea who I am?" the man sputtered. "I'm Bartholomew Prescott. My father owns the largest bank in the territory." "And yet," Drew replied evenly, "that doesn't seem to grant you the right to harass this woman." By now, the confrontation had drawn the attention of others in the store, including the older men who had been conversing at the counter. The distinguished gentleman Drew had overheard earlier strode toward them, his expression severe. "What's happening here?" he demanded, looking between his daughter and the two men. "Nothing, father," the young woman said quickly. "Mr. Prescott was just leaving." "I was merely expressing my admiration for your daughter, Mr. McIntosh," Bartholomew said smoothly, recovering his composure, "when this trapper decided to insert himself where he wasn't wanted." McIntosh studied Drew with shrewd eyes. "And you are?" "Drew Ramsey, sir." He kept his voice respectful but didn't lower his gaze. "I was only concerned for the lady's comfort." "How gallant," Bartholomew sneered, a mountain man with delusions of chivalry. The elder McIntosh glanced at his daughter, whose chin had lifted slightly in defiance. "Nora, were you uncomfortable?" "Mr. Prescott was being insistent despite my clear refusal of his company," she answered, her voice steady. "Mr. Ramsey merely pointed out the impropriety." The older Prescott had joined them now, his face darkening with anger. "McIntosh, are you going to allow this wilderness vagabond to insult my son?" The tension in the store was palpable. Drew stood his ground, though he regretted the public confrontation. This was precisely why he avoided towns, the politics, the posturing, the complicated dance of status that had nothing to do with a man's true worth. "I believe," McIntosh said carefully, "that there has been a misunderstanding. My daughter appreciates Mr. Prescott's attentions but is perhaps overwhelmed today." He turned to Drew. "While your concern for propriety is noted, Mr. Ramsey, I suggest you complete your business and be on your way." Drew nodded once, understanding the dismissal for what it was. He turned to go, but not before catching the flash of disappointment in Nora's eyes, not directed at him, but at her father's diplomatic retreat. "Mr. Ramsey," she called out suddenly, causing him to pause. "You dropped something." She held out a folded piece of paper that Drew was certain had not fallen from his possession. Nevertheless, he accepted it with a nod of thanks, noting the slight pressure of her fingers as she placed it in his palm. He paid for his supplies and left the mercantile, aware of the whispers that followed him. Only when he'd secured his purchases to his saddle did he unfold the paper Nora had pressed into his hand. The stable behind Carrington Hotel, noon, I wish to thank you properly. Drew stared at the note, considering. The smart thing would be to mount up and ride back to his cabin, where the wilderness made sense in ways towns never would. And yet, the mystery of why this clearly well-bred young woman would want to meet a mountain man she'd only just met intrigued him almost as much as the discovery he'd made in the canyon. Perhaps, he thought as he led his mare toward the livery, there might be answers to both puzzles in Silver Creek after all. Nora paced the shadowed interior of the stable, the rich scent of hay and horsehair filling her nostrils as she checked her pocket watch for the third time. She shouldn't be here. The daughter of Harlan McIntosh, the merchant king of the Montana Territory, did not meet strange men in stables. And yet, something about Drew Ramsey's quiet dignity in the face of the Prescott's contempt had stirred her curiosity. The stable door creaked open, sending her heart racing as she pressed herself against the wall of an empty stall. A shaft of bright noon sunlight cut through the dusty air, and Drew Ramsey's silhouette appeared, tall and cautious. "Miss McIntosh," he called softly, letting the door swing closed behind him. Nora stepped forward, clutching her reticule nervously. Up close, without the distraction of the confrontation, she could see him more clearly. His eyes were a deep green, watchful and intelligent. He carried himself with none of the swagger of the town men, but there was strength in his stillness. "Mr. Ramsey, thank you for coming." She straightened her spine, summoning the poise her finishing school teachers had drilled into her. "I wanted to express my gratitude for your intervention this morning." He studied her face carefully. "You could have thanked me publicly." "Why the secrecy?" The directness of his question caught her off guard. Town men circled with pleasantries and veiled intentions. This was refreshing if disconcerting, "because my father would not approve and because I have a proposition for you." She took a steadying breath. "But first I must ask, why did you speak up? Most men in this town wouldn't dare cross the Prescotts, especially not for a woman they don't know." Drew removed his hat, turning it in his hands thoughtfully. "Where I come from, right is right, regardless of who's watching or whose toes get stepped on." He paused. "The wilderness doesn't care about a man's name or his father's money. It judges only by what he does." Nora felt something shift inside her, a recognition of a shared understanding despite their vastly different lives. The town doesn't operate by those rules. "Which is why I avoid towns when possible." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "What's this proposition?" Nora hesitated only briefly. "I need to leave Silver Creek tonight." His eyebrows rose, running away. "Securing my independence," she corrected. "My father intends to announce my engagement to Bartholomew Prescott at the Founders' Day celebration next week. It's a business arrangement, the Prescott's banking connections for my father's mercantile empire. My consent appears to be an afterthought." "And what do you want?" The question was so simple, yet no one had bothered to ask it of her before. "I want to determine my own fate. My aunt in San Francisco has invited me to stay with her. She's a widow who runs her late husband's shipping company. She understands what it means to make one's own way." "Why tell me this?" Drew asked, though his expression suggested he'd already guessed her answer. "Because I need a guide, someone who knows the trails that would allow me to avoid the main roads where my father's men would surely look for me." She lifted her chin. "I would pay you, of course, generously." Drew was silent for a long moment, studying her with those penetrating green eyes. "The trail to California is dangerous, especially for a woman traveling alone with a single guide. Indians, outlaws, natural hazards. I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Ramsey. I've crossed the country by wagon train. I can ride and shoot." "Even so, what makes you think you can trust me?" "I'm a stranger to you." Nora had asked herself the same question repeatedly since forming this desperate plan. "You stood up for me when it gained you nothing but trouble. That suggests a certain character." She straightened her shoulders. "Besides, I don't have many options. Will you help me?" Drew set his hat back on his head, his expression unreadable. "I can't." Disappointment crashed through her. "Cannot or will not?" "Both. I have urgent business of my own that keeps me here for at least a few days." His voice softened slightly at her crestfallen expression. and in good conscience I couldn't guide you on such a journey without proper preparation. The mountains don't forgive mistakes. Nora felt tears threatening and blinked them back fiercely. Crying wouldn't solve anything, it never had. I understand, thank you for your honesty at least. She made to move past him toward the door. Miss McIntosh, he said, stopping her, I didn't say I wouldn't help you, only that I can't guide you to California right now. Hope flickered. What are you suggesting? I have a cabin in the mountains. It's remote, no one from town ever ventures that far into the wilderness. You could stay there while I complete my business, and we could plan a safer journey afterward. That would give you time to learn some essential skills for the trail as well. Nora considered his offer. Hiding in the mountains wasn't her original plan, but it would get her away from the Prescotts and give her time to think. How do I know this isn't a trap of some kind? Drew's expression remained serious. You don't, just as I don't know if you're truly running from an unwanted marriage or if this is some elaborate ruse for reasons I can't fathom. At some point, trust becomes necessary. The irony wasn't lost on her. Trust was precisely what she'd learned not to rely upon. And yet, something about this quiet mountain man's straightforward manner made her inclined to believe him. When would we leave, she asked. Tonight, as you wanted. Can you ride in the dark? Yes. Meet me at the north edge of town, past the sawmill, at midnight. Bring only what you can carry on horseback and dress warmly. The mountains get cold at night, even in summer. Nora nodded, her mind already racing through preparations. I'll be there, she hesitated. Mr. Ramsey, you mentioned business that keeps you here. May I ask what it is? I'd like to know what I'm waiting for. Drew seemed to debate internally before reaching into his jacket pocket and withdrawing a small leather pouch. He opened it and tipped something into his palm, then held it out to her. Nora gasped. Nestled in his calloused hand was a rough stone shot through with thick veins of gold, not the fine dust or small nuggets commonly found in the streams around Silver Creek, but a rich specimen that hinted at something much more substantial. 3 days ago, I found signs of a vein in a hidden canyon on my property. I've been panning gold in small amounts for years to supplement my trapping, but nothing like this. He returned the specimen to his pouch. I need to register my claim properly before word gets out. There are those in this town who wouldn't hesitate to jump a claim if they knew. Nora thought of Prescott and the other mining investors who frequented her father's store with their ruthless business tactics and bottomless ambition. You're wise to be cautious. The Prescotts especially have been known to acquire claims through methods that don't bear close examination. Drew nodded grimly. All the more reason for discretion. If you still want my help, be ready at midnight, and Miss McIntosh. Tell no one. I won't, she promised, and Mr. Ramsey, thank you. As she slipped out of the stable and hurried back toward her father's house, Nora felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, a flutter of hope, dangerous as it might be, that perhaps there was a path to freedom after all. The grandfather clock in the hallway had just finished striking 11 when Nora secured the last button on her riding habit and surveyed her preparations. She had chosen her clothing carefully, practical garments layered for warmth with her most serviceable boots. Her saddlebags contained only essentials, a change of clothes, basic toiletries, a small medical kit, and a leather pouch containing the jewelry she could sell if necessary. Most importantly, sewn into the hem of her riding skirt were the gold coins she'd been secretly saving since her mother's death, insurance against the day she might need to forge her own path. That day had arrived sooner than expected. Nora moved silently through the darkened house, avoiding the creaking floorboard outside her father's study and the loose stair third from the bottom. The servants had long since retired to their quarters, and her father was attending a meeting of mining investors at the Prescott's home, no doubt finalizing the details of her impending engagement. The thought hardened her resolve as she slipped through the kitchen and out the back door to the small stable where her mare, Penny, was kept. The horse nickered softly in recognition as Nora led her out, already saddled and ready for their journey. Rather than risk the main streets, Nora guided Penny through the alleyways and back lots of Silver Creek, her heart pounding each time a dog barked or a window lit up in a house they passed. The town gradually thinned until they reached its northern edge where the sawmill stood dark and silent against the star-filled sky. Drew was already waiting, a shadow among shadows, his horse standing patiently beside him. He nodded in greeting as she approached. "You came," he said simply, as if he'd half expected her to change her mind. "I said I would." Nora's voice was steadier than she felt. Now that the moment had arrived, the enormity of what she was doing, leaving everything familiar behind to follow a near stranger into the wilderness, threatened to overwhelm her. Drew seemed to sense her unease. "It's not too late to turn back," he said quietly. Nora straightened in her saddle. "Yes, it is. I've made my choice." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "We'll follow the creek north for a few miles before cutting west into the mountains. Stay close and match my pace. If we need to stop for any reason, I'll raise my hand. If you need to stop, call out softly." "I understand." Drew mounted his horse in one fluid motion and led the way past the sawmill toward the tree line beyond. Nora followed, resisting the urge to look back at the town that had been her home for the past 2 years. There was nothing there for her now but the cage of a loveless marriage. They rode in silence, the only sounds the soft thud of hooves on earth and the occasional call of a night bird. The moon was nearly full, bathing the landscape in silver light that made the journey possible. As Silver Creek fell away behind them, Nora felt a curious mixture of terror and exhilaration. For the first time in her life, she was truly on her own, dependent on no one but herself and this quiet mountain man who might be her salvation or her downfall. The trail gradually steepened as they left the valley floor and began to climb into the foothills. Drew set a careful pace, occasionally pausing to listen to the night sounds around them or to check their backtrail. Each time, Nora found herself holding her breath, half expecting to see lanterns bobbing in pursuit, but the wilderness behind them remained dark and still. After what seemed like hours, Drew guided them off the main trail and onto a nearly invisible path that wound between towering pines. The forest closed around them, the moonlight now filtering in dappled patterns through the canopy above. "We're entering my property now," Drew said over his shoulder, the first words spoken since they'd left town. "Few people know this trail exists." Nora nodded, though she doubted he could see the gesture in the darkness. Her muscles ached from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle, but she bit back any complaint. This discomfort was a small price for freedom. The path twisted through the forest, sometimes climbing steeply, other times descending into shadowy gullies where streams gurgled unseen in the darkness. Just when Nora thought they must surely stop for the night, the trees thinned and they emerged into a small clearing bathed in moonlight. Drew's cabin stood at the far edge, a solid structure of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney and a small covered porch. It wasn't large, but it had been built with obvious care, the logs fitted tightly together, the roof in good repair. A small barn or stable stood nearby, along with what appeared to be a workshop of some kind. "This is home," Drew said simply as he dismounted and came to help Nora from her saddle. She accepted his assistance, her legs nearly buckling as her feet touched the ground. Drew's hand steadied her briefly, strong and sure, before he stepped back to a respectful distance. "It's not what you're accustomed to," he said, a note of apology in his voice as he gestured toward the cabin, "but it's solid and weather-tight." Nora looked around the clearing, taking in the vegetable garden to one side of the cabin, the stack of firewood neatly arranged along the wall, the small creek that burbled along the clearing's edge. There was a peacefulness here, a sense of rightness that Silver Creek with all its pretensions had never possessed. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. Drew's expression in the moonlight suggested surprise, followed by something warmer that he quickly masked. "Let me tend to the horses. You can go inside, the door isn't locked." Nora climbed the 2 steps to the porch, her legs protesting after the long ride. The door opened easily at her touch, revealing a single large room that constituted the main living space of the cabin. Moonlight streaming through the windows showed a stone fireplace along one wall, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a cooking area, and a narrow bed in the far corner. Everything was simple but meticulously maintained. She was standing in the center of the room, unsure what to do next, when Drew entered carrying her saddlebags. He set them on the table, then busied himself lighting a lantern that hung from one of the ceiling beams. The warm glow chased the shadows into the corners, making the cabin seem more welcoming. "You take the bed," Drew said, nodding toward the corner. "I'll sleep by the fire." Nora frowned. "I can't take your bed." You can and will, he replied, his tone gentle but firm. You've had a long journey and a longer day ahead of you tomorrow. I sleep under the stars more often than not. A bedroll by the fire is luxury enough. Too exhausted to argue, Nora nodded gratefully. Thank you. Drew moved to the fireplace and knelt to arrange kindling and logs. There's water in the pitcher on the washstand if you'd like to refresh yourself. I'll have a fire going shortly to take the chill off. Nora used the water to wash her face and hands, wincing at the dirt and grime from their journey. By the time she'd finished, Drew had a small fire crackling in the hearth. The warmth spread through the cabin, easing some of the stiffness from her tired muscles. Are you hungry? Drew asked, straightening from the fire. I don't have much prepared, but I could make coffee and there's bread and jerky. Nora shook her head. Just sleep, I think. She glanced toward the bed, suddenly acutely aware of the intimacy of their situation, alone in this isolated cabin, miles from the nearest neighbor. Drew seemed to read her thoughts. You're safe here, Miss McIntosh. I gave you my word to help you, not harm you. He moved toward the door. I'll check on the horses once more, then sleep out here. The latch on the door works from the inside if you wish to secure it. When he'd gone, Nora sat on the edge of the bed, removed her boots, and loosened her clothing just enough for comfort. The sheets were clean and smelled of the outdoors as if they'd been dried in mountain air and sunshine. Despite her racing thoughts and the strangeness of her surroundings, exhaustion claimed her quickly. She was dimly aware of Drew returning, the quiet sounds of him moving about the cabin, before she drifted into a dreamless sleep. The smell of coffee and something baking roused Nora from the deepest sleep she'd had in months. For a moment she was disoriented, the unfamiliar weight of a rough woolen blanket and the scent of pine confusing her senses. Then memory flooded back her escape, the midnight ride, Drew's cabin in the wilderness. She sat up, wincing at muscles stiff from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's windows, suggesting it was well into morning. Drew stood at the small cook stove, his back to her as he tended to something in a cast-iron skillet. Good morning, she said, her voice rough with sleep. He turned, a brief smile crossing his features. Good morning. I was beginning to think you might sleep the day away. Nora smoothed her hair self-consciously, aware of how disheveled she must look. What time is it? Nearly 9, he gestured toward a door she hadn't noticed the night before. There's a washroom of sorts through there if you'd like to freshen up. It's primitive, but there's clean water and privacy. Grateful, Nora gathered her saddlebag and slipped through the door to find a small space with a copper basin, a pitcher of water, and a mirror hanging on the wall. The window was covered with a piece of oiled paper that admitted light while ensuring privacy. She made the most of the simple facilities, washing her face and hands, changing into clean undergarments and her most practical day dress, and arranging her hair in a simple braid. When she emerged, Drew had set the table with 2 tin plates containing what appeared to be cornbread and some kind of fruit preserves. A pot of coffee steamed invitingly. It's not what you're used to, he said apologetically as he held a chair for her, but it will keep your strength up. It looks wonderful, Nora assured him, touched by his consideration. I didn't mean to sleep so late and leave all the morning work to you. Drew poured coffee into 2 tin cups. You needed the rest, besides I'm used to rising with the sun. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, Nora surprised by how hungry she was and how good the simple food tasted. The cornbread was warm and slightly sweet, the preserves made from berries she couldn't identify but which had a tart, refreshing flavor. Huckleberries, Drew said, noticing her expression. They grow wild on the north slopes. They're delicious, she sipped her coffee, finding it strong but good. I must thank you again for helping me, Mr. Ramsay. I know it's an imposition. Drew, he corrected, if you're going to be staying here, Mr. Ramsay seems overly formal. Nora nodded. Then you must call me Nora, she set her cup down carefully. How long do you think it will take to register your claim and make arrangements? Drew's expression grew thoughtful, a few days at least. I need to file the paperwork with the mining office and there are supplies we'll need for the journey to California. He studied her face. Are you certain that's still what you want? It's a difficult journey, even in summer. What alternatives do I have? Nora asked. If I return to Silver Creek, my father will simply force the marriage to Bartholomew. If I stay here, she trailed off, suddenly aware of the impropriety of what she was suggesting. You can stay as long as you need to, Drew said quietly, but people will talk if they discover you're here. Nora laughed without humor. People will talk regardless. The moment my absence is discovered, there will be speculation. By now, my father has likely realized I'm gone. He'll have men searching. Not up here, Drew assured her. Few people even know this cabin exists, and those who do have no reason to connect me to your disappearance. Still, we should have a plan for if they do come looking. Nora straightened her shoulders. I won't put you in danger because of my choices. Drew's green eyes studied her with a mixture of respect and concern. We'll cross that bridge if we come to it. For now, it's best if you stay close to the cabin while I'm gone. There's a root cellar behind the house if you need to hide, though I pray it doesn't come to that. Nora nodded, trying to ignore the flutter of anxiety his words provoked. When will you go to town? Tomorrow. Today I'll show you around the property so you'll be comfortable while I'm gone. He rose from the table. If you're finished, we can start now. The day passed in a blur of practical instruction. Drew showed her how to operate the water pump where he kept emergency supplies and the basics of tending the small garden that provided much of his food. He explained the boundaries of his property, pointing out landmarks she could use for orientation if she needed to venture out. This is the heart of it, he said in the early afternoon, leading her along a narrow trail to the edge of a small canyon. The path descended steeply to a creek that glittered in the sunlight. This is where I found the gold. Nora peered down at the creek bed where signs of Drew's work were visible, a simple sluice box, some tools, piles of sorted rock. It doesn't look like much, she admitted. Drew smiled. That's the point. The real find isn't here in the open but farther up where the creek emerges from a crack in the canyon wall. There's a small cave system that few know about. That's where I found the specimen I showed you. And you're certain it's a substantial deposit. As certain as anyone can be without proper mining equipment. He gazed down at the creek, his expression a mixture of hope and wariness. It could be nothing, a single rich pocket that's quickly exhausted, or it could be enough to change everything. What would you do, Nora asked, genuinely curious, if it is as rich as you hope? Drew considered the question seriously. Secure the legal rights first, then work it carefully, bringing in only trusted men to help. I have no interest in a boomtown springing up on my doorstep or in the kind of wealth that makes a man a target. He glanced at her. I like my solitude. Nora studied his profile, struck by how different his values were from those she'd grown up with. Her father had always pursued wealth with single-minded determination, regardless of the cost to his family or his own peace of mind. Drew seemed to want just enough to secure his independence, nothing more. That's admirable, she said softly. Most men would see only the opportunity for riches. Most men haven't lived in the mountains long enough to understand what true wealth is, Drew replied, then looked almost embarrassed by his philosophical turn. We should head back. There's still the workshop to show you, and we need to prepare food for tomorrow. As they walked back toward the cabin, Nora found herself watching Drew with growing curiosity. He moved through the forest with an easy confidence that spoke of long familiarity, occasionally pointing out plants she might find useful or signs of wildlife she should be aware of. His knowledge was extensive, his manner of sharing it straightforward and practical. By the time they returned to the clearing, the sun was lowering toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the ground. Drew led her to the small outbuilding she'd noticed the night before. This is where I do most of my work in the winter months, he explained, pushing open the door. Inside, Nora found a surprisingly organized space filled with tools, furs in various stages of preparation, and what appeared to be woodworking projects. A half-finished chair stood in one corner, its lines simple but elegant. You made this? She asked, running her hand along the smooth wood of the chair back. Drew nodded, a touch of self-consciousness in his expression. Winter nights are long. I find working with my hands passes the time. It's beautiful work, Nora said sincerely, noting the care that had gone into the joinery. Thank you, he cleared his throat. I should check the snares before dark. Would you mind starting dinner? There's stew meat and vegetables by the stove. Nora agreed readily, eager to contribute something to their arrangement. As she walked back to the cabin, she found herself smiling. Despite the uncertainty of her situation, there was something profoundly peaceful about this place and the man who had created it. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt as if she could breathe freely. Inside the cabin, Nora set about preparing a simple stew with the ingredients Drew had left out. The domestic task was soothing, giving her hands something to do while her mind processed the events of the past 24 hours. By the time Drew returned with several rabbits he'd caught in his snares, she had the stew simmering pleasantly over the fire. "Something smells good," he said as he set his catch on the small table outside the door where he apparently prepared game for cooking. "Just a simple stew," Nora replied, oddly pleased by his appreciation. "Though I'm afraid I'm not much of a cook, my father always kept servants for that." "It's hard to ruin a stew," Drew assured her with a small smile. "These will be for tomorrow and the next day while I'm gone." They ate dinner as night fell, the stew turning out better than Nora had feared. Drew talked about his plans for the following day, the early departure, the precautions he would take to ensure no one followed him back, the supplies he would bring for their eventual journey west. "I may be gone for 2 days," he warned. "If there's any sign of trouble, use the root cellar. There's a hidden compartment beneath the storage barrels where you can conceal yourself if necessary." Nora nodded, determined to show no fear despite the knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. "I'll be fine. I have food, water, shelter, and your rifle if needed." Drew's expression suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea of leaving her alone but saw no alternative. "Just be cautious. Don't light fires during the day when the smoke might be visible, and stay within the clearing unless absolutely necessary." "I will," Nora promised, "and you be careful in town. If my father has realized I'm missing, he'll have men watching everyone and everything." "I know how to avoid unwanted attention," Drew assured her. He rose from the table carrying their empty bowls to the wash basin. "You should rest. Dawn comes early in the mountains." Nora hesitated, then asked the question that had been bothering her since the previous night. "Where will you sleep?" "I can't keep taking your bed." Drew's expression remained carefully neutral. "The bedroll by the fire is comfortable enough. I've slept in far worse conditions." "Still, it's not right. This is your home," she gestured at the single room. "Perhaps we could rig some kind of screen or curtain for privacy, and I could sleep on the floor sometimes to give you a turn in the bed." "That won't be necessary," Drew said firmly. "I insist you take the bed for as long as you're here." Nora recognized the stubborn set of his jaw and decided not to push the issue for now. "Thank you, you're very kind." Drew looked almost uncomfortable at the gratitude. "It's nothing. Just the way anyone should treat a guest." But as Nora prepared for sleep that night, she knew it wasn't nothing, and not the way just anyone would treat an unexpected houseguest who had arrived under such unusual circumstances. Drew Ramsey was proving to be a man of exceptional character, and that realization was both comforting and unsettling in ways she wasn't quite ready to examine. The cabin was silent when Nora woke the following morning, the gray light of pre-dawn seeping through the windows. Drew's bedroll was already neatly stowed, the fire banked to glowing embers. On the table she found a note written in a surprisingly elegant hand. "Gone to town, left food prepared in the root cellar, expected return by tomorrow evening. Stay safe." Dr. Beside the note lay a small revolver that she recognized as a pocket model, easily concealed but effective at close range. The gesture touched her deeply. Drew trusted her enough to leave her one of his weapons, understanding that her safety might depend on it. The day stretched before her, empty and quiet in a way she had never experienced. Silver Creek, for all its frontier pretensions, had always been full of noise and bustle. Her father's house had servants coming and going, callers to entertain, social obligations to fulfill. This profound stillness, broken only by birdsong and the gentle rustle of wind through the pines, was both unsettling and strangely liberating. Nora busied herself with practical tasks, tidying the already neat cabin, fetching water from the pump, examining the vegetables in the garden to determine what might be ready for harvest. By midday, she had exhausted these chores and found herself standing in the center of the clearing, at loose ends. On impulse, she retrieved her journal from her saddlebag and settled on the cabin's porch, determined to record her thoughts and experiences. As her pen scratched across the paper, Nora found herself writing not just about her escape in current circumstances, but about the growing certainty that she could never return to the life she had left behind. Even if she could avoid the marriage to Bartholomew Prescott, going back to Silver Creek would mean surrendering to her father's authority once more. At 19, she was legally under his control until she married or reached her majority. The thought of exchanging one form of subjugation for another was unbearable now that she had tasted freedom, however briefly. The afternoon waned, shadows lengthening across the clearing as the sun moved toward the western peaks. Nora prepared a simple meal from the provisions Drew had left, then sat on the porch again, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The vastness above her seemed to mirror the expansiveness she felt within, a sense of possibility that had been absent from her life for too long. As night fully descended, bringing with it a deeper chill, Nora reluctantly went inside. She banked the fire as she had seen Drew do, added a log that would burn slowly through the night, and prepared for bed. The silence, so welcome during the day, now seemed to press in around her, making every creak of the cabin's timbers and rustle of wind sound ominous. Nora kept the small revolver close as she lay in Drew's bed, staring up at the rough-hewn ceiling beams. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her, her mind racing with questions about what the future might hold. Would Drew's gold claim prove valuable? Would they successfully make the journey to San Francisco? And what would she do when she arrived there? Her aunt's invitation had been genuine, but Nora had no illusions about being a permanent guest. She would need to find a way to support herself eventually. These practical concerns mingled with more personal questions that she tried in vain to dismiss. Why had Drew really helped her? What would happen when their paths inevitably diverged? And why did that prospect fill her with a vague sense of loss, despite the fact that she barely knew the man? Sometime in the small hours, Nora finally drifted into a restless sleep, her dreams filled with winding mountain trails and a pair of steady green eyes that seemed to see through all her carefully constructed defenses. The second day alone passed more quickly than the first, as Nora settled into a routine of sorts. She had just finished washing the dishes from her evening meal when a sound from outside froze her in place, the distant but unmistakable rhythm of hoofbeats approaching along the trail. Her heart hammering, Nora quickly doused the lantern and moved to the window, peering cautiously through the gathering dusk. Relief flooded through her when she recognized Drew's broad-shouldered silhouette as he guided his horse into the clearing. He wasn't alone, however. A second horse followed, heavily laden with supplies. Nora opened the cabin door as Drew dismounted, noting immediately the tension in his posture. "You're back early," she said, stepping onto the porch. "Is everything all right?" Drew secured his horse's reins to the hitching post before turning to her, his expression grim. "We need to talk, but first help me unload these supplies. We may need to move quickly." Alarmed, Nora hurried to assist him, carrying packages and bundles into the cabin while Drew tended to the horses. When everything was inside, Drew closed and barred the door, then ran a hand through his hair in a gesture of uncharacteristic agitation. "What's happened?" Nora asked, fear knotting in her stomach. Drew lit the lantern, then turned to face her. "Silver Creek is in an uproar. Your disappearance has been discovered, and your father has offered a substantial reward for information leading to your return." Nora had expected as much, though the confirmation still sent a chill through her. "Did anyone connect you to my disappearance?" "Not directly, but there are rumors." Drew began unpacking supplies, his movements precise despite his obvious concern. "The timing of my visit to town was noted, particularly by the Prescotts. Bartholomew remembered our confrontation in the mercantile and suggested to the sheriff that I might have information." "Were you questioned?" Nora's voice rose slightly in alarm. "Briefly, I said I had seen you in the store but knew nothing of your whereabouts." Drew's mouth tightened. "I don't like lying, but I liked the alternative less." "I'm sorry to have put you in that position," Nora said softly. Drew waved away her apology. "That's not the worst of it. While I was registering my claim, I overheard Prescott Sr. talking with another investor. They've been quietly buying up property in this area, including parcels that border my land." "Why would they do that? This area hasn't shown any significant mineral deposits before, has it?" Not that anyone knows of, Drew confirmed, but Prescott mentioned geological surveys and something about the old man's maps that makes me think they have information others don't. Nora frowned, a memory stirring. My father keeps old survey maps in his study, records from the earliest expeditions into the territory. He's quite proud of the collection. She paused, thinking, and he's been meeting frequently with the Prescotts in recent weeks, supposedly about my engagement. Drew's expression darkened. If they've found something in those maps that suggests gold in this area. They might already know about your claim, Nora finished, understanding the implications, or at least suspect there's value here worth pursuing. Exactly, Drew set a bag of coffee beans on the shelf with more force than necessary. I filed the paperwork legally, so my claim is secure for now, but that won't stop men like Prescott if they believe there's enough gold to justify more aggressive methods. Nora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. She had seen firsthand the lengths to which men would go in pursuit of mineral wealth. Towns like Silver Creek were built on such ambition, and the line between legitimate business and outright theft was often blurred beyond recognition. "What will you do?" she asked. "What we will do," Drew corrected, "is prepare to leave sooner than planned. I purchased supplies for the journey to California, and I've arranged for a trusted friend to meet us at a way station near the territorial border. He can guide us the rest of the way while I return to protect my claim." The pragmatic plan made sense, but Nora felt an unexpected pang at the thought of continuing the journey without Drew. She pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the practical aspects. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow at first light if you're well enough to travel," Drew said, studying her face. "It will mean hard riding and rough camping until we reach the way station." "I'm ready," Nora assured him, squaring her shoulders. "I've rested well these past days." Drew nodded, some of the tension leaving his expression. "Good. Now let me show you what I've brought. You'll need to pack only essentials for the journey." As they sorted through the supplies, Drew explained the route they would take, south and west through the mountains, avoiding the main trails where search parties might be watching. He had purchased proper riding clothes for her, sturdy and plain enough not to draw attention, as well as a wide-brimmed hat that would shield her distinctive blonde hair from view. "I hope I guessed your size correctly," he said, a hint of embarrassment coloring his voice as he handed her the bundle of clothing. "The storekeeper's wife helped, but I had only a general description to go by." Nora unfolded the riding skirt and jacket, touched by his thoughtfulness. "These look perfect, thank you." They continued preparations late into the night, packing saddlebags with only the most essential items and planning their route in detail. Drew spread a map across the table, pointing out landmarks and potential hazards, explaining alternative paths they might take if they encountered trouble. Finally, with everything ready for their pre-dawn departure, Drew insisted Nora get some rest. "Tomorrow will be difficult," he warned. "You should sleep while you can." Nora hesitated, looking at the narrow bed and then at Drew, who was clearly as exhausted as she was. "You need rest too," she said firmly. "And you haven't had a proper night's sleep in your own bed since I arrived." Drew shook his head. "I'm fine by the fire." "You're not," Nora countered, "and we both need to be at our best tomorrow." She took a deep breath, steadying herself for what she was about to propose. "The bed is narrow, but not so narrow that we couldn't both use it, back to back, with propriety maintained." Drew's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, Nora feared she had scandalized him beyond recovery. But then his expression softened into something like reluctant amusement. "Miss McIntosh, Nora," he corrected himself, "I believe that suggestion would horrify your father even more than your running away." "My father's opinions no longer govern my actions," she replied with more confidence than she felt. "And it's a practical solution to our current situation, nothing more." Drew studied her face for a long moment, then nodded once. "Very well, but I insist on placing my bedroll on top of the mattress as a barrier of sorts." Nora agreed to this compromise, relieved that he had seen the sense in her suggestion rather than being offended by it. They prepared for sleep with careful courtesy, each turning away while the other changed into night clothes. Drew arranged his bedroll down the center of the narrow bed, creating a symbolic division that Nora found both reassuring and slightly disappointing in a way she wasn't prepared to examine. They lay down back to back, the small mattress dipping slightly under their combined weight. Despite the awkwardness of the arrangement, Nora found the steady sound of Drew's breathing oddly comforting. The cabin's familiar creaks and settling noises, which had seemed ominous when she was alone, now blended into a soothing backdrop. "Thank you," she said softly into the darkness, "for everything you've done." There was a pause before Drew replied, his voice equally quiet. "You don't need to thank me." "I do," Nora insisted. "You've risked everything to help a stranger. Most people wouldn't do that." "Most people haven't lived alone in the wilderness long enough to understand how much we all depend on each other's decency," Drew said, echoing his earlier sentiment about wealth. "Get some sleep, Nora. Dawn will be here soon enough." As exhaustion finally claimed her, Nora's last conscious thought was that she had never met anyone quite like Drew Ramsey, a man whose quiet strength and unfailing kindness made her question everything she had ever believed about what it meant to survive in this harsh frontier world. The forest was still shrouded in pre-dawn darkness when they set out, the only sounds the soft thud of their horses' hooves on the pine needle-covered trail and the occasional call of an early waking bird. Drew led the way, his form a shadow against the gradually lightening eastern sky. Nora followed closely, her body tense with a mixture of anxiety and determination. They rode in silence until the sun cleared the eastern ridge, bathing the mountains in golden light that revealed the breathtaking beauty of their surroundings. Pine forests gave way to open meadows dotted with wildflowers, then to rocky slopes where stunted trees clung tenaciously to thin soil. "We'll follow this ridge south for several miles," Drew explained during a brief stop to rest the horses. "Then drop down to the valley on the western side. There's a trapper's cabin there where we can shelter tonight." Nora nodded, trying to ignore the stiffness in her muscles. The riding clothes Drew had purchased fit well enough, providing more freedom of movement than her usual attire, but nothing could fully prepare her for the rigors of a full day in the saddle through such challenging terrain. "Is something wrong?" Drew asked, noticing her discomfort as she shifted her weight. "Nothing I can't manage," Nora assured him, straightening her spine. "Lead on." Drew's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he pointed to a distant peak. "That's Miner's Cap. When we see it directly to our west, we'll know we're nearing the descent into the valley." The day wore on, the sun climbing higher in a cloudless sky. Despite her determination, Nora found herself struggling as the trail grew steeper and more treacherous. Drew set a careful pace, frequently checking back to ensure she was managing, but by midday it was clear she needed a longer rest. They stopped in a small clearing beside a stream, dismounting to allow the horses to drink. Nora sank gratefully onto a fallen log, trying to massage the ache from her lower back without drawing attention to her discomfort. Drew busied himself filling their canteens, then brought one to her along with a small parcel of jerky and dried fruit. "Eat something," he urged. "It will help." Nora accepted the food, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Drew spoke again. "We can rest a bit longer if you need to," he offered, his tone carefully neutral. "There's no shame in admitting when you need time to recover." "Is it that obvious?" Nora asked, embarrassed. "Only to someone who's watching," Drew replied with a small smile, "and I've been watching." The simple admission sent an unexpected warmth through Nora. "I'll be fine after a short rest," she assured him. "I won't slow us down." "You're not slowing us down," Drew said firmly. "You're keeping a pace that most experienced mountain travelers would find challenging. I'm impressed, not concerned." Nora found herself pleased by his praise, though she tried not to show it. "Tell me more about this trapper's cabin we're heading for," she said, changing the subject. Drew took a drink from his canteen before answering. "It belonged to an old mountain man named Jeremiah Finch. When he died 3 winters ago, he had no family to claim it. Trappers and hunters use it as shelter when passing through, leaving supplies for the next traveler when they can." "That's a curious custom," Nora observed. "In town, people lock their doors and guard their possessions. The wilderness has different rules," Drew explained. "Out here, a man's survival often depends on the generosity of those who passed before him. A cabin left open, a cache of dry firewood, even a few matches, these can mean the difference between life and death." Yet you lock your cabin door when you leave, Nora pointed out. Drew's expression grew thoughtful. That's different. My cabin is my home, not just shelter, and lately I've had more reason to be cautious. Because of the gold. Partly, Drew's eyes met hers briefly before looking away. And partly because I've had more to protect. The implication hung in the air between them, neither quite ready to acknowledge it directly. After a moment, Drew stood, brushing pine needles from his trousers. We should move on if you're rested enough. I'd like to reach the cabin before dusk. They continued their journey, the trail gradually becoming more defined as they approached the ridge overlooking the western valley. By late afternoon, they had reached the point where they could see Miner's Cap directly to their west, its distinctive flat top tinged pink by the lowering sun. We'll start our descent here, Drew said, pointing to a narrow trail that wound down the steep western slope. Stay close and let your horse pick its way carefully. These mountain ponies are sure-footed, but the trail can be treacherous. The descent was slow and nerve-wracking, the path occasionally so steep that Nora had to lean back in her saddle to maintain her balance. The valley floor seemed impossibly distant, a patchwork of dark forest and golden meadows far below them. As they neared the bottom of the slope, Drew suddenly raised his hand in the signal they had agreed upon for stopping. Nora reined in her horse immediately, her heart racing as Drew dismounted and moved cautiously forward on foot. He returned a few minutes later, his expression grim. There are fresh tracks on the trail ahead, he said quietly. At least 3 horses, heading in the same direction we are. Could it be ordinary travelers? Nora asked, though she already suspected the answer. Drew shook his head. The tracks are too fresh, and this trail isn't used much except by those who know the area well. He glanced at the sun, now sinking rapidly toward the western peaks. We need to find shelter for the night, but I don't think we should risk the trapper's cabin if others are nearby. What do we do? Nora asked, fighting to keep the fear from her voice. Drew considered for a moment, his eyes scanning the valley below. There's a place I know, not far from here, a small cave in the rock face about halfway down. It's not comfortable, but it's defensible and well hidden. Lead on, Nora said, trying to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. They continued their descent, Drew now moving with increased caution, frequently stopping to check for signs of other travelers. The sun had nearly set by the time they reached the cave he had mentioned, a narrow opening in the rock face partially hidden by a stand of juniper trees. It doesn't look like much, Drew admitted as they dismounted, but it's dry and relatively warm. We can keep a small fire near the back where the smoke will disperse through cracks in the ceiling without being visible from below. They led the horses into a small clearing behind the junipers, where Drew quickly removed their saddles and hobbled them so they could graze without wandering far. Then he helped Nora gather what they would need for the night from their saddlebags before guiding her into the cave. The interior was larger than the entrance suggested, with a ceiling high enough for them to stand upright and space for them to spread their bedrolls comfortably. Drew set about gathering stones to create a small fire pit while Nora organized their provisions. We'll have a cold supper, Drew decided, keeping his voice low. No sense risking a fire until full dark, and even then we'll keep it small. They ate quietly, sharing dried meat, hard cheese, and the last of the cornbread Drew had packed. As night fell completely, Drew built a tiny fire, just enough to take the chill from the air without creating significant smoke or light that might be visible from outside. I'll take the first watch, he said as they prepared for sleep. I'll wake you in a few hours. Nora wanted to protest that she could take a turn at watch as well, but exhaustion was rapidly overtaking her. She simply nodded, spreading her bedroll near the fire and wrapping herself in a blanket against the cave's persistent chill. Despite her fatigue, sleep was elusive. Every sound from outside, the whisper of wind through the junipers, the occasional snort of the horses, the distant call of a night bird, seemed magnified by her anxiety. Drew sat near the cave entrance, a silhouette against the night sky, his rifle across his knees. Drew, she whispered finally, giving up on sleep, do you think they're looking for us specifically? He turned toward her, his face in shadow. I don't know, he admitted. It could be Prescott's men searching for my claim, or it could be your father's people looking for you. Either way, it's best we avoid them. I'm sorry to have brought this trouble to you, Nora said, the guilt she'd been suppressing rising to the surface. You didn't bring it, Drew replied firmly. The trouble was already there, waiting. Prescott would have come after my claim eventually, whether you were involved or not. Still, I've complicated things for you. Nora sat up, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. Perhaps I should continue alone to the way station. Your friend could still guide me to California. Drew's response was immediate and unequivocal. Absolutely not. These mountains are dangerous enough for experienced travelers, let alone someone making the journey alone. Besides, he added more softly, I gave my word to see you safely to the way station, and I intend to keep it. The conviction in his voice stirred something in Nora, a sense of being truly valued for perhaps the first time in her life. Not for her father's wealth or her potential as a business alliance, but simply for herself. Thank you, she said softly, unable to articulate the full depth of her gratitude. Drew nodded once, then turned his attention back to the cave entrance. Try to get some sleep, tomorrow will be another long day. This time, exhaustion won out over anxiety, and Nora drifted into a fitful sleep punctuated by dreams of pursuit through endless mountain forests. When Drew gently shook her awake what seemed like only moments later, the small fire had burned down to embers, and the cave was filled with the deep chill that precedes dawn. It's time to move, he said quietly. I've heard horses on the trail below. Fully alert now, Nora quickly rolled up her bedding and gathered her few belongings while Drew doused the remaining embers with dirt. They moved silently out of the cave to where their horses waited, saddling them by touch in the pre-dawn darkness. We'll head south through the valley floor, Drew explained in a whisper as he helped Nora mount. There's more cover in the forest, and we can reach the old mining road by nightfall if we push hard. The day that followed was a blur of tense vigilance and hard riding. They kept to the trees whenever possible, avoided open spaces where they might be spotted from higher ground, and spoke only when necessary. Drew's knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable as he led them through hidden ravines and along game trails that didn't appear on any map. By midday, they had seen no further sign of the other riders, but Drew remained cautious, insisting they continue their evasive route rather than risking the more direct path to the way station. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly, and Nora found herself fighting exhaustion and thirst despite their regular brief stops to rest the horses. You're doing well, Drew encouraged during one such pause, handing her a canteen. The mining road isn't far now. Nora drank gratefully, then passed the canteen back. What's this way station like, the one where your friend will meet us? It's an old stage stop, no longer on the main line since the railroad came through farther south, Drew explained. A man named Johnson runs it now, offers meals and lodging to travelers, no questions asked. He's trustworthy and, more importantly, he has no love for the Prescotts after they forced him off a mining claim years ago. And your friend? The one who will guide me to California. Drew's expression softened slightly. Michael Sullivan. We trapped together for several seasons before he moved on to guiding emigrant parties west. He knows the trails to California better than anyone, and he's a good man. You'll be safe with him. Nora nodded, trying to ignore the hollow feeling that expanded in her chest at the thought of continuing her journey without Drew. It was foolish, she knew, to have grown so attached to him in such a short time. And yet, there was no denying the connection that had formed between them, a mutual respect and understanding that transcended their different backgrounds. What will you do, she asked, after you return to your claim? Drew's gaze turned distant, focusing on the mountains to the north. Secure it legally, work it carefully, and hope the Prescotts decide it's not worth the trouble of forcing me out. His mouth quirked in a rare, wry smile. And perhaps build a better cabin, one with more than one room. It's a good plan, Nora said, trying to sound supportive despite the pang of regret that he didn't mention any possibility of their paths crossing again. They continued riding, the forest gradually thinning as they approached what had once been a well-traveled road, but was now little more than a wide trail through the wilderness. The sun was setting when they finally reached it, casting long shadows across the rutted dirt track. We'll follow this east for about 3 miles, Drew said, pointing along the road. The way station is in a small clearing just past a creek crossing. They rode side by side now that the trail was wide enough, their horses settling into a steady walk as darkness gradually enveloped the forest around them. The silence between them was comfortable, though tinged with a melancholy that neither seemed willing to address directly. As they rounded a bend in the road, the way station came into view, a sturdy log building with light glowing from its windows and smoke curling from the stone chimney. Several horses were hitched to a rail outside, and the sound of voices and laughter drifted through the evening air. "More travelers than I expected," Drew murmured, reining in his horse at the edge of the clearing. "Wait here while I make sure it's safe." Nora nodded, remaining in the shadows as Drew rode forward toward the building. She watched anxiously as he dismounted and approached the door, his posture alert but casual, as if he were just another traveler seeking shelter for the night. A moment later, the door opened, spilling more light into the clearing. A burly man stepped out, exchanged a few words with Drew, then clasped his hand warmly. Drew turned and waved Nora forward, signaling that all was well. Relief flooded through her as she guided her horse toward the way station. Perhaps they had outrun pursuit after all. Perhaps now the hardest part of their journey was behind them. Little did she know that the challenges they had faced so far were merely a prelude to the trials that awaited them, trials that would test not only their survival skills but the bond that had begun to form between them. The interior of Johnson's way station was surprisingly comfortable for such a remote outpost. A large main room served as dining area and gathering space, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall. Rough-hewn tables and benches provided seating for travelers, while a long counter at the back separated the dining area from what appeared to be a kitchen. A narrow staircase led to what Nora presumed were sleeping quarters above. Half a dozen men occupied the room, some eating at the tables, others nursing drinks by the fire. All eyes turned to examine the newcomers as Johnson, the proprietor, led them inside. "This is Drew Ramsey," he announced to the room at large and his traveling companion. Nora noted with gratitude that he didn't use her name. "They'll be staying the night, so show them proper courtesy." The men nodded or murmured greetings before returning to their conversations and meals. Johnson led Drew and Nora to a small table in the corner, relatively private compared to the others. "I'll have my wife bring you some food," he said, keeping his voice low. "Your usual room is available upstairs, Drew. I put your friend in the adjoining one, with the connecting door unlocked as you requested." Drew thanked him with a nod and Johnson moved away toward the kitchen. Nora leaned closer to Drew, speaking quietly. "Your friend Michael, is he here?" Drew shook his head slightly. "Not yet. Johnson says he's expected sometime tomorrow." He glanced around the room, assessing the other travelers. "None of these men seem to be from Silver Creek, but it's best if we keep to ourselves regardless." A stout woman, presumably Johnson's wife, approached their table with 2 plates of steaming stew and a loaf of fresh bread. "You both look half-starved," she said with motherly concern, setting the food before them. "Eat up, then get some rest. You have the look of folks who have been pushing hard on the trail." The meal was simple but delicious, especially after days of travel rations. Nora ate hungrily, only gradually becoming aware of the curious glances directed their way by some of the other patrons. Most were the typically appraising looks any woman might expect in a frontier establishment, but one man, a lean, hard-faced individual seated alone near the fire, watched them with a more calculating interest. Drew had noticed as well. "Don't look directly at him," he murmured when he caught Nora's eye. "But the man by the fire, I recognize him. He sometimes works for the Prescotts." Nora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Do you think he knows who I am?" "I doubt it," Drew replied, keeping his voice low. "But he might recognize me from town. We should retire early, avoid drawing attention." They finished their meal quickly after that, and Drew arranged with Johnson for their horses to be stabled and cared for overnight. Then they climbed the narrow stairs to the upper floor, where a short hallway led to several small bedrooms. "These are our rooms," Drew said, indicating 2 adjacent doors. "As Johnson mentioned, there's a connecting door between them. I suggest we leave it unlocked in case there's trouble." Nora nodded, understanding the precaution. "Do you really think that man downstairs is a threat?" Drew's expression was grim. "I don't know. But I've learned it's better to be overly cautious than caught unprepared." He hesitated, then added, "I'll check around outside, make sure there's nothing suspicious. Lock your door after me and open only if you hear 3 soft knocks." After Drew left, Nora entered her room, a small, Spartan space containing a narrow bed, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a single chair. A window overlooked the clearing in front of the way station, and a door in the side wall presumably connected to Drew's room. She washed as best she could with the cold water provided, changed into her nightclothes, and was just about to extinguish the lamp when 3 soft knocks sounded on her hallway door. She opened it cautiously to find Drew standing there, his expression troubled. "There are fresh tracks around the stables," he said quietly as he entered, closing the door behind him. "Someone examined our horses recently, since they were put away for the night." "The man from downstairs?" Nora asked, fear creeping back into her voice. "Possibly, I didn't see him, but Johnson says he arrived alone earlier today, claiming to be heading south to the territorial border." Drew ran a hand through his hair in frustration. It could be innocent, another traveler simply admiring the horses, but combined with his connection to the Prescotts. "What should we do?" Nora asked, her mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. Drew considered for a moment. "We'll leave before dawn, take a different route than planned. With luck, we can reach the territorial crossing before anyone realizes which way we've gone." "But what about your friend Michael? I thought he was meeting us here." "I'll leave a message with Johnson," Drew decided. "Michael will understand and follow as soon as he can." He looked at her seriously. "This means at least another day of hard travel together before we reach a place where I can safely leave you in Michael's care." Nora should have felt disappointed by this complication in their plans, but instead found herself oddly relieved at the prospect of more time with Drew. The realization was unsettling, and she quickly pushed it aside, focusing on practical matters. "I'll be ready to leave whenever you say," she assured him. Drew nodded, his gaze lingering on her face a moment longer than necessary. "Try to get some sleep. I'll wake you when it's time." After he'd gone, Nora lay in the narrow bed, too tense for sleep despite her exhaustion. The way station had gradually grown quieter as the other travelers retired, but occasionally she could hear footsteps in the hallway or voices from downstairs where Johnson presumably still tended to late arrivals. Her mind turned again to the future awaiting her in California, a city she had never seen, a life she could barely imagine. Her aunt was her mother's sister, a woman of independent spirit who had scandalized society by taking over her late husband's shipping business rather than selling it and remarrying as expected. Nora had always admired her from afar, though their correspondence had been limited by her father's disapproval of his sister-in-law's unconventional choices. Would she find a place in San Francisco? Would her aunt welcome her unexpected arrival, or would Nora find herself once again unwanted and in the way? And what skills did she have that might translate into a means of supporting herself? Her education had been focused on making her an attractive match for a successful man, not on preparing her for independence. These questions circled in her mind, joined by others more personal and immediate. What would happen to Drew once he returned to his claim? Would the Prescotts find a way to take it from him, legally or otherwise? And why did the thought of never seeing him again after they parted create such an ache in her chest? Sometime in the small hours, Nora finally drifted into a fitful sleep, only to be awakened what seemed like moments later by Drew's soft knock at the connecting door. The room was still dark, the first hint of pre-dawn light barely visible through the window. "It's time," Drew whispered as she opened the door. "Dress quickly and pack your things. We need to be on the trail before the others wake." Nora dressed in the darkness, her fingers fumbling with buttons and lacings in her haste. She had just finished packing her few belongings when a sound from downstairs made them both freeze, boots on the staircase, moving with deliberate slowness as if trying to avoid detection. Drew motioned for silence, then moved to the hallway door, listening intently. The footsteps stopped, followed by the soft creak of a door, not the one to Nora's room, but nearby. "Someone's checking the rooms," Drew breathed, barely audible. "We need to leave now, through the window." Nora's heart raced as Drew quickly moved to the window, easing it open without a sound. He leaned out, surveying the drop to the ground below. "It's not too far," he whispered, "and there's a sloped roof over the back porch that will make it easier." Outside in the hallway, another door creaked open, closer this time. Drew motioned urgently for Nora to hurry. She slung her saddlebag over her shoulder and moved to the window where Drew was already climbing out. He balanced on the narrow ledge, then lowered himself carefully onto the porch roof. "Hand me your bag," he whispered, reaching up. Nora passed it down, then prepared to follow, her skirts hampering her movements. Just as she was swinging her leg over the sill, the hallway door to her room rattled as someone tried the handle, finding it locked. "Hurry," Drew urged, reaching up to help her. Nora slipped through the window just as a more forceful rattle shook the door. She landed awkwardly on the porch roof beside Drew, nearly losing her balance before he steadied her with a firm grip. "This way," he murmured, leading her to the edge of the roof where it was a shorter drop to the ground. Drew lowered himself first, then reached up to help Nora. They had just reached the ground when a shout came from above. Someone had entered Nora's room and discovered their escape. Without hesitation, Drew grabbed her hand and pulled her into the shadows behind the way station, heading for the stable. "We need the horses," he said, his voice tight with urgency, "if we can get mounted before they organize a pursuit." They reached the stable just as more shouts erupted from the way station. Johnson appeared at the back door, gesturing frantically for them to hurry. "Your horses are ready," he called in a harsh whisper. "I suspected trouble when that fellow started asking questions last night." Inside the stable, they found their horses already saddled, their bags attached. Drew clasped Johnson's hand gratefully. "We owe you." "Just get clear of here," Johnson replied grimly. "And tell Michael I'm sorry I couldn't wait for him. There's a message in your saddlebag explaining where to meet you." They mounted quickly and rode out the back of the stable, away from the way station and into the forest beyond. Behind them, Nora could hear the commotion growing as their pursuers organized themselves. Drew led them at a fast pace through the trees, following a narrow trail that wound steadily upward into the foothills. "Where are we going?" Nora called, ducking low branches as they rode. "There's an old mining trail that crosses the ridge to the south," Drew replied over his shoulder. "Few people know it exists. If we can reach it before they catch up to us, we might lose them in the high country." The sky was lightening rapidly now, dawn spreading pink and gold across the eastern horizon. Nora glanced back, seeing no immediate signs of pursuit, but knowing it wouldn't be long before the man from the way station and possibly others would be on their trail. They rode hard for over an hour, the terrain growing steeper and more challenging. Nora's muscles screamed in protest, but she gritted her teeth and kept pace with Drew, determined not to slow them down. Finally, as they crested a small rise, Drew reined in his horse, signaling for Nora to do the same. "Listen," he said, his voice hushed. In the distance behind them, barely audible over their own breathing and the snorting of their tired horses, came the sound of pursuit, hoofbeats and men's voices, still far off but undeniably following their trail. "They're persistent," Nora observed, trying to keep the fear from her voice. Drew nodded grimly. "Too persistent for this to be just about you running away from home. I think they know about the gold claim." "Can we outrun them?" "Not indefinitely. Our horses need rest and so do we." Drew gazed up at the ridgeline ahead, calculating, "But we don't need to outrun them, just outsmart them. Come on." They continued up the trail, moving at a more sustainable pace now that they knew pursuit was still distant. The forest gradually thinned as they climbed, giving way to rocky slopes and scattered stands of stunted pine. By mid-morning, they had reached a point where the trail split, one fork continuing along the ridgeline, the other descending into a narrow canyon. Drew stopped again, considering their options. "They'll expect us to take the ridge trail," he said, thinking aloud. "It's the more obvious route toward the territorial border." "So we take the canyon?" Nora asked, eyeing the steep, rocky descent with trepidation. Drew shook his head. "No, that's what they'll expect once they realize we didn't take the ridge. We need to do something they won't anticipate." He dismounted, examining the ground carefully. "What are you thinking?" Nora asked, watching as he moved back and forth along the trail. "We're going to double back," Drew decided, remounting. "There's a game trail about half a mile back that branches off to the east. It's barely visible unless you know what to look for. We'll take that, loop around behind our pursuers, and then cut south through the high meadows." The plan was risky but made sense. They rode back down the trail until Drew spotted the nearly invisible path he had mentioned. little more than a slight depression in the undergrowth that disappeared into a dense thicket of young pines. "Stay close," he warned as they entered the thicket. "The trail is easy to lose and the thorns are vicious." The going was slow and difficult, the narrow path forcing them to ride single file through brush that caught at their clothing and scratched any exposed skin. But Drew's woodcraft proved sound. The game trail gradually widened into a more established path that wound eastward through increasingly open forest. By early afternoon, they had executed a wide arc that Drew believed would place them well behind and to the east of their pursuers. They paused in a small clearing to rest the horses and eat a hurried meal of jerky and dried fruit. "Do you think we've lost them?" Nora asked, scanning the forest around them. Drew's expression was cautious. "For now, perhaps. But they'll realize what we've done eventually and adjust their search." He studied the position of the sun. "We've made good time. If we push on, we can reach the territorial crossing by nightfall." "And then what?" Nora asked, the question that had been haunting her finally finding voice. Drew was silent for a moment, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Then you continue to California as planned. Michael will find us at the crossing point. Johnson's message will see to that." "And you'll return to your claim," Nora said, unable to keep a note of sadness from her voice. "I have to," Drew replied simply. "It's all I have." The unspoken question hung between them. Could it be something more? Could there be a future that included both his mountain home and her presence in it? But neither was ready to voice such thoughts, the barriers of their different worlds still too formidable to overcome with mere words. They resumed their journey, riding south and east through high meadows dotted with wildflowers and occasional stands of aspen. The beauty of the landscape was breathtaking, but Nora found herself unable to fully appreciate it, her mind too preoccupied with thoughts of the impending separation. As the afternoon wore on, clouds began to gather over the distant peaks to the west, suggesting the possibility of an evening storm. Drew watched them with concern, pushing their pace a bit faster. "We should reach the crossing before the weather turns," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. The territorial crossing was not a formal border post. Montana Territory simply gave way to Idaho Territory along a geographic boundary marked by a particular arrangement of peaks known as the Seven Sisters. A narrow pass between two of these peaks formed a natural gateway used by travelers moving between the territories. They were within a few miles of this landmark when the storm that had been threatening finally broke. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, driven by a wind that seemed determined to push them back the way they had come. Lightning flashed among the peaks ahead, followed by the deep rumble of thunder. "We need to find shelter," Drew called over the noise of the storm. "The crossing will be too exposed in this weather." Nora nodded, already soaked to the skin despite her riding cloak. Drew led them toward a rocky outcropping where the trees grew thick enough to provide some protection from the worst of the rain. They dismounted, leading their nervous horses into the relative shelter of the rocks. "We'll wait it out here," Drew decided, helping Nora remove her sodden cloak. "These summer storms usually pass quickly." They huddled together in the meager shelter, their bodies pressed close by necessity as the storm raged around them. Drew had produced a blanket from his saddlebag, damp but still providing some warmth as they shared it. "I'm sorry for this delay," Drew said after a particularly close lightning strike made them both flinch. "If the storm passes soon, we might still reach the crossing by nightfall." "And if it doesn't?" Nora asked, unable to suppress a shiver. Drew's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Then we find better shelter for the night and continue in the morning." He looked down at her, his expression softening. "Either way, I'll make sure you're safe before I leave." The simple promise carried more weight than either of them acknowledged. They sat in silence for a time, listening to the storm gradually moving eastward, the thunder becoming more distant, the rain easing from a downpour to a steady drizzle. "Tell me about San Francisco," Drew said suddenly. "What do you hope to find there?" The question caught Nora by surprise. They had spoken so much of the practical aspects of her journey but little of what awaited at its end. "Independence, I suppose," she answered slowly. "A chance to determine my own path without my father's interference or the expectations of Silver Creek society." "And your aunt, what is she like?" "Strong-willed, unconventional." Nora smiled slightly at the memory of the few letters they had exchanged. After her husband died, everyone expected her to sell his shipping business and live quietly on the proceeds. Instead, she took control of it herself and, by all accounts, has been remarkably successful. She sounds like someone who would understand your desire for independence, Drew observed. I hope so, Nora hesitated, then added, but I don't want to simply exchange one form of dependency for another. I need to find a way to support myself, to build something of my own. Drew nodded, understanding in his eyes. What would you build if you could choose anything? Nora had never been asked such a question before, and she found herself considering it seriously. A school, perhaps. Or a business of some kind where women could work with dignity instead of the limited options they currently have. She looked up at him curiously. What about you? What would you build with the proceeds from your gold claim if it proves as valuable as you hope? Drew was quiet for so long that Nora thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice held a note of vulnerability she hadn't heard before. A home, he said simply, not just a cabin but a true home, something permanent and less solitary. The implication hung in the air between them, neither quite ready to address it directly. The rain had nearly stopped now, the forest around them glistening with moisture as late afternoon sunlight began to break through the thinning clouds. We should move on, Drew said, rising and offering his hand to help Nora to her feet. If we push hard, we can still reach the crossing before full dark. They mounted their horses, now rested from the forced stop, and continued their journey. The trail was muddy and slick in places, forcing them to proceed more cautiously than Drew would have liked, but they made steady progress toward the Seven Sisters peaks that marked the territorial boundary. As the sun dipped toward the western horizon, they finally crested a rise that gave them their first clear view of the crossing, a narrow pass between two towering peaks, the trail winding through it visible as a thin ribbon against the rocky terrain. We made it, Nora said with relief, scanning the area for any sign of pursuit. Drew nodded, though his expression remained vigilant. The crossing itself is just ahead, but we need to be cautious. It's a natural choke point. If someone wanted to intercept travelers, this would be the place to do it. They approached slowly, Drew frequently stopping to survey their surroundings and listen for any unusual sounds. The crossing was quiet, however, showing no signs of recent travel other than the muddy tracks left by what appeared to be a single rider heading in the opposite direction. Michael, perhaps, Drew suggested, examining the tracks. These are fresh, made since the rain stopped. He might have crossed into Montana territory looking for us. Will he be able to find us? Nora asked, concerned. Johnson's message included several possible meeting points, Drew explained. The first is just on the other side of the crossing, an old trapper's shelter about 2 miles west of here. We'll head there for the night and hope Michael doubles back when he doesn't find sign of us in Montana. They crossed the territorial boundary as the last light of day faded from the sky, Idaho territory welcoming them with a spectacular sunset that painted the clouds in shades of gold and crimson. Nora felt a curious mixture of relief and apprehension as they left Montana behind. Relief to be beyond her father's immediate reach, apprehension at the unknown future awaiting her, and the imminent parting from Drew. The trapper's shelter proved to be little more than a 3-sided linta built against a large boulder, but it was dry and defensible, with a good view of the approach trail. Drew quickly gathered wood for a small fire while Nora tended to the horses, rubbing them down and ensuring they had water from a nearby stream. We should be safe enough here, Drew said as they settled beside the fire, their wet clothes steaming slightly in the heat. Even if our pursuers realize we've crossed the border, they're unlikely to continue the search in the dark. Nora nodded, exhaustion from their long day beginning to take its toll. What if Michael doesn't find us tomorrow? Then we continue to the next meeting point, Drew replied, his expression thoughtful. There's a small settlement about a day's ride from here where Michael often stops when guiding parties west. If we don't meet on the trail, we'll find him there. They ate a simple meal of the remaining provisions Johnson had provided, then prepared for sleep as best they could in the limited shelter. Drew insisted that Nora take the spot farthest from the opening, where the linta provided the most protection from the night air. "I'll take first watch," he said, positioning himself where he could see both Nora and the approach trail. "Get some rest, tomorrow may be another long day." Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded Nora once again. The knowledge that their time together was rapidly coming to an end weighed heavily on her mind. Once Michael arrived, Drew would return to his claim and she would continue to California. Their paths, so unexpectedly entwined these past days, would diverge, perhaps never to cross again. The thought filled her with a sadness that surprised her with its intensity. In the short time they had traveled together, Drew had become more than just a guide or protector. He had become someone she trusted implicitly, someone whose quiet strength and unwavering integrity had made her reconsider everything she thought she knew about what made a man worthy of respect. "Drew," she said softly, breaking the silence, "I need to ask you something." He turned toward her, his face half illuminated by the firelight. "What is it?" Nora gathered her courage. "If circumstances were different, if there were no gold claim to protect and no need for me to reach California, what would you want then?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with implications neither had been willing to voice until now. Drew's expression remained unreadable for a long moment, his eyes searching hers as if trying to determine what answer she sought. "I would want," he began slowly, "what I suspect would be impossible regardless of circumstances. A woman like you doesn't belong in a crude cabin in the wilderness, no matter how much gold might be found nearby." "You haven't answered my question," Nora pressed gently. "I didn't ask what you think is possible, I asked what you would want." Drew's gaze never wavered. "I would want you to stay," he said simply. "I would want the chance to build something together, a life that combines your education and refinement with my knowledge of the land. A true partnership, not the unequal arrangement your father planned for you with Prescott." The honesty of his answer took Nora's breath away. No man had ever spoken to her with such directness about matters of the heart, without artifice or calculation. "And what if I told you that's what I want too?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Drew's expression softened, but a shadow of doubt remained in his eyes. "I would say that you've been through a tremendous upheaval, and decisions made in such circumstances aren't always those you'd make with time and distance." "You think I don't know my own mind?" Nora asked, a hint of challenge in her tone. "I think," Drew replied carefully, "that you've had a taste of freedom after a lifetime of constraint. It's natural to associate that freedom with the person who helped you achieve it. But that doesn't mean I'm the right choice for your future." Nora sat up straighter, indignation overcoming her fatigue. "That's not fair. You're suggesting my feelings are merely gratitude or confusion, not genuine regard." Drew sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of inner conflict. "Nora, look at the reality of what I'm offering. A life in the wilderness, miles from the nearest town, no society, no culture, none of the refinements you've been raised with. The gold claim may be valuable, but it won't change the fundamental isolation of that existence." "You speak as if I haven't considered these things," Nora said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "As if I'm a child making an impulsive decision rather than a woman who has spent her entire life preparing for a future she never wanted." "And what future do you want?" Drew asked, his tone softening. "One where I'm valued for myself, not for the advantages my father's wealth might bring or the connections my marriage might secure." Nora met his gaze unflinchingly. "One where I have a partner who respects my mind and my capabilities, not merely my appearance or my dowry. In the short time we've spent together, you've shown me more of that respect than any man I've ever known." Drew was silent for a long moment, the conflict in his expression evident. "It's not that simple," he finally said. "There are practical considerations beyond just what we might feel for each other." "Of course there are," Nora agreed, "and those deserve careful thought. But isn't that a conversation we should have together, rather than you deciding for both of us that it's impossible?" The logic of her argument seemed to catch Drew by surprise. His expression shifted from resistance to thoughtful consideration. "You're right," he conceded. "It should be a conversation, but now isn't the time, with pursuers potentially still on our trail and your safety not yet secured." "When then?" Nora asked, unwilling to let the moment pass entirely. Drew considered the question seriously. "When you've reached San Francisco safely, when you've had time to experience the city to see what options might be available to you there. If after a month or two you still believe that a life in the mountains with me is what you want, he paused, then continued with quiet certainty, I'll be waiting for your letter. It wasn't the immediate resolution Nora might have hoped for, but she recognized the wisdom in his suggestion. Making such a life-altering decision in the midst of danger and upheaval might indeed be unwise. A month, she countered, and I'll write regardless of my decision. Drew's lips curved in a small smile. A month, then. The tension between them eased, replaced by a tentative understanding that left room for hope without demanding immediate commitments. They fell into a more comfortable silence, the fire crackling softly as the night deepened around them. Eventually, Nora drifted into sleep, her dreams for once peaceful rather than filled with pursuit and danger. When Drew gently woke her to take her turn at watch, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. All quiet so far, he reported as they exchanged places. Wake me if you hear or see anything unusual. Nora's watch passed uneventfully, the forest around them gradually coming alive with morning birdsong and the rustle of small animals. She found herself studying Drew's sleeping face, noting the way his features relaxed in repose, making him appear younger and less careworn. The sun had just cleared the eastern ridgeline when the sound of approaching hoofbeats brought Nora instantly alert. She reached for the rifle Drew had left beside her, then hesitated, unsure whether the arrival represented friend or foe. Drew, she called softly, moving to wake him. Someone's coming. He was instantly awake, taking the rifle from her hands and moving to a position where he could see the trail while remaining partially concealed. Stay behind me, he instructed, his voice tense. The hoofbeats grew louder, then slowed as the rider apparently spotted their campsite. Drew raised the rifle, ready but not yet aiming directly at the approach. Hello, the camp, a man's voice called. Drew Ramsey, are you there? It's Michael Sullivan. Relief washed over Drew's features. We're here, Michael, he called back, lowering the rifle. Come on in. A moment later, a horseman appeared on the trail, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and a thick red beard. He wore the practical clothing of an experienced frontiersman, and his saddle was hung with the tools and supplies of someone accustomed to long journeys. Drew, my friend, he exclaimed, dismounting with an easy grace that belied his size. Johnson's message had me worried, said you were in some kind of trouble. Drew clasped Michael's hand warmly. Nothing we couldn't handle, but it's good to see you. He turned to Nora. Michael Sullivan, this is Nora McIntosh. Nora, this is the friend I told you about, the best guide in the territories. Michael removed his hat, revealing a shock of red hair that matched his beard. Miss McIntosh, he said with surprising gentility, it's a pleasure. Drew's message didn't explain much, just that you needed safe passage to San Francisco. It's a complicated story, Nora replied with a small smile, but yes, that's the essence of it. Drew quickly outlined the situation for Michael, Nora's need to escape an unwanted marriage, the complication of the gold claim, and the pursuit they had evaded. He omitted any mention of their personal feelings or the agreement they had reached the previous night. Michael listened attentively, nodding occasionally. Prescott's involved, you say? That explains the men I passed yesterday, heading east toward the crossing. Looked like hired guns to me, though they claimed to be prospectors when I spoke with them briefly. How many? Drew asked sharply. 4 that I saw, Michael replied, his expression serious. Led by a lean fellow with a scar along his jaw, mean-looking bunch. Drew and Nora exchanged concerned glances. That sounds like the man from the way station, Nora said. And he's found reinforcements. All the more reason to get you moving quickly, Drew decided. If they've crossed into Idaho territory, they could be heading back this way, having realized we've given them the slip. Michael nodded in agreement. I know a route west that few others use, an old Indian trail that follows the river through the canyon lands. It's rugged going in places, but it will keep us well away from the main trails where Prescott's men might look for us. The use of us didn't escape Nora's notice. You're coming with us, Drew? She asked, trying to keep the hope from her voice. Drew hesitated, clearly torn. I should go back, secure my claim before Prescott finds a way to jump it. He looked at Michael. But if there are 4 armed men searching for us, it might be safer for Nora if I continue at least part of the way. I'd welcome the extra gun, Michael said frankly. The trail west isn't as dangerous as it once was, but it's still no place for a woman traveling with just one escort. The decision visibly weighed on Drew, his sense of responsibility toward Nora competing with his need to protect his property and future livelihood. Finally, he nodded. I'll come as far as Fort Boise. By then, you should be well beyond Prescott's reach and I can return with a clear conscience. Though Fort Boise was still far short of California, Nora couldn't help feeling relieved that their parting had been postponed, if only briefly. It would give them more time to consider what might be possible between them once the immediate danger had passed. We should move out immediately, Michael advised, glancing at the sun. Those men I passed could be on their way back already, especially if they've figured out you crossed the border. They broke camp quickly, leaving no trace of their presence beyond the cold ashes of their fire. Michael led the way, setting a brisk pace along a trail that soon diverged from the main route, winding instead through a series of rocky draws and narrow valleys that followed a small, swift-flowing river. As they rode, Michael proved to be both knowledgeable about the country and pleasantly talkative, sharing stories of his experiences guiding emigrant parties and pointing out landmarks of interest. His easy manner helped distract Nora from the tension of their situation, though Drew remained vigilant, frequently checking their backtrail for any sign of pursuit. By midday, they had put considerable distance between themselves and the territorial crossing, the terrain gradually changing from forested mountains to more open, rocky country interspersed with sagebrush flats. They stopped briefly to rest the horses and eat a cold meal from Michael's supplies, then continued westward, following the increasingly dramatic canyon carved by the river. We'll make camp early tonight, Michael decided late in the afternoon as they approached a sheltered bend in the river. There's good grazing for the horses here, and the canyon walls will hide our fire from any observers. The campsite proved to be an excellent choice, a small, grassy area nestled against the canyon wall, with the river providing fresh water and a natural barrier on one side. While Michael tended to the horses, Drew and Nora gathered firewood and prepared a more substantial meal than they had enjoyed in days, using some of the supplies Michael had brought. As night fell and they sat around the small fire, Nora found herself studying the 2 men, noting the easy camaraderie between them despite their obvious differences. Where Drew was reserved and thoughtful, Michael was outgoing and quick to laugh, yet there was clearly deep respect between them, built on shared experiences and mutual trust. "How did you 2 meet?" Nora asked as they finished their meal. Michael chuckled, glancing at Drew. "Should I tell it or will you?" Drew's lips quirked in a rare smile. "Your version is always more entertaining than mine." "It was about 5 years ago," Michael began, settling more comfortably against his saddle. "I was guiding a party of naturalists, scientists studying the plants and animals of the high country. We got caught in an early blizzard, lost our bearings completely. 2 days we wandered, getting more desperate by the hour." He paused to take a sip of coffee before continuing. "Just when things were looking truly dire, this lone trapper appears out of the swirling snow like some kind of mountain spirit. Didn't say much, just gestured for us to follow and led us straight to a sheltered ravine where we could wait out the worst of the storm." Drew shook his head slightly at the dramatization, but didn't interrupt. "Turned out to be Drew, of course," Michael continued. "He'd spotted our tracks and knowing a storm was coming had followed to make sure we found shelter, probably saved all our lives that day." "You would have found your way eventually," Drew said modestly. "Maybe," Michael conceded, "or maybe they'd have found our frozen bodies come spring thaw. Either way, I owed him. When the storm cleared, he guided us back to more familiar territory, then disappeared back into his mountains without even waiting for proper thanks." "I had trap lines to check," Drew explained with a shrug. "Always practical," Michael laughed, "but fate has a way of bringing people back together. The next season I was trapping the same area and stumbled across his cabin. We ended up working together for a couple of years before I got restless and turned to guiding full-time." The story painted a picture of Drew that matched what Nora had already observed, a man of quiet competence and unassuming generosity, who helped others not for recognition or reward but simply because it was the right thing to do. And now you've saved another lost traveler, she said softly, meeting Drew's eyes across the fire. Something unspoken passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of the connection that had formed and the possibilities it might hold. Michael, observant despite his jovial manner, glanced between them with raised eyebrows but made no comment. As the night deepened and the conversation lulled, Michael volunteered to take the first watch, leaving Drew and Nora to settle by the fire. There was a new awareness between them now, a mutual understanding that what they felt was no fleeting attachment born of danger and proximity, but something with the potential to grow into something much deeper. "Get some rest," Drew said softly as Nora arranged her blanket near the fire. "We have a long ride ahead tomorrow." Though exhaustion pulled at her, Nora found herself reluctant to succumb to sleep, knowing that each day brought them closer to Fort Boise and the inevitable parting. But Drew was right, they needed to be alert and ready for whatever challenges the journey might bring. As she drifted toward sleep, Nora's last conscious thought was that perhaps, for the first time in her life, she had found someone who saw her clearly, not as a daughter to be controlled or a wife to be acquired, but as a person of value in her own right. And that realization, more than any promise of gold or freedom, filled her with hope for the future. The next 5 days of travel passed without significant incident, though not without challenges. The rugged terrain demanded careful navigation, and their pace was slower than any of them would have preferred. Michael led them along trails that few others knew, sometimes following dry creek beds or game paths that barely deserved the name trail. Each evening they made camp in sheltered locations, always with an eye toward defensibility and concealment. Drew continued to check their backtrail regularly, but there was no sign of Prescott's men or any other pursuers. Gradually, the constant tension began to ease, replaced by a more comfortable rhythm of travel and companionship. Michael proved to be an excellent travel companion, knowledgeable about the country, skilled at finding game to supplement their provisions, and possessed of seemingly endless stories to entertain them during the evening hours around the campfire. He spoke of the changes he had witnessed across the territories, the gradual taming of what had once been wilderness, and the characters he had encountered along the way. "The West is changing faster than most people realize," he observed on their 4th night out. "The railroads are pushing through, bringing more settlers each year. Towns are springing up where there was nothing but open country a decade ago." "Is that good or bad?" Nora asked, curious about his perspective. Michael considered the question seriously. "Both, I suppose. There's something lost when the wilderness is conquered, a freedom that can't exist alongside fenced land and property deeds. But there's something gained too, stability, community, progress of a sort." "And where do people like you fit into this changing landscape?" Nora wondered. "Guides and trappers and mountain men." "Some adapt," Michael replied with a philosophical shrug. "Learn new skills, find niches that still value what they know. Others drift farther into what wilderness remains, staying one step ahead of civilization." He glanced at Drew. "And a few find a balance, keeping one foot in each world." Drew had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. "The mountains still hold secrets that will take generations to uncover. There will always be a place for those who understand the land and its ways. Especially if those secrets include gold," Michael added with a knowing smile. Drew acknowledged the point with a slight nod. "Gold changes things for better or worse. It brings attention, development, conflict. And opportunity," Nora added, thinking of what Drew's claim might mean for his future, their future perhaps. "Yes," Drew agreed, his eyes meeting hers briefly, "if managed wisely." These moments of connection between them had grown more frequent as they traveled, shared glances, conversations apart from Michael, small gestures of consideration and care. Though they had not spoken further of their agreement or the feelings behind it, there was an unspoken understanding that something significant had changed between them. Michael, for his part, observed these developments with the benign interest of an old friend, occasionally raising an eyebrow or hiding a smile but offering no comment. He treated Nora with unfailing courtesy, never questioning the circumstances that had led to her flight from Silver Creek or the relationship developing between her and Drew. On the morning of the 6th day, as they crested a ridge overlooking a broad valley, Michael pointed to a distant cluster of buildings nestled against the far hills. "Fort Boise," he announced. We should reach it by nightfall. Nora felt her heart sink at the confirmation that they had nearly reached the point where Drew had said he would turn back. She glanced at him, finding his expression unreadable as he studied the distant settlement. "Is it safe there?" Drew asked. "Prescott's influence might extend even this far." "Safe enough," Michael assured him. "It's a proper army post now, not just a trading station like in the old days. Prescott might have connections, but he can't openly interfere with a woman traveling under military protection." "Military protection?" Nora asked, surprised. Michael nodded. "I have an old friend who serves as an officer there. Once I explain the situation, without unnecessary details, he'll ensure you have an escort for the next leg of your journey. The Army regularly sends patrols to Fort Vancouver, and from there, it's straightforward to arrange passage to San Francisco." The plan was sensible and would certainly provide the safety that Drew was concerned about. Yet Nora couldn't help feeling disappointed that their journey together was coming to an end sooner than she had hoped. The month they had agreed upon seemed suddenly too long to wait for resolution. They continued toward Fort Boise, the trail gradually improving as it joined more established routes. By late afternoon, they were traveling on a proper road, passing occasional farms and ranches as they neared the settlement. The sight of cultivated fields and permanent structures after days in the wilderness was a stark reminder of the civilized world they were re-entering, a world with different rules and expectations than those that had governed their time together in the mountains. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Fort Boise came clearly into view, a substantial compound surrounded by a growing community of civilian buildings. The fort itself consisted of a parade ground flanked by barracks, officers' quarters, and administrative buildings, all constructed of locally quarried stone rather than the log palisades of earlier frontier posts. "We'll stable the horses at the livery in town rather than at the fort itself," Michael decided as they approached. "Less official attention that way, at least until we've had a chance to speak with my friend." They rode into the small settlement that had grown up around the military post, drawing curious glances from locals unaccustomed to seeing a well-dressed young woman in the company of two rough-looking frontiersmen. Michael led them to a modest livery stable where a grizzled older man greeted him by name, suggesting this wasn't his first visit to the area. "Need stalls for the night, Jake," Michael explained as they dismounted. "And a recommendation for lodging where the lady can have proper accommodations." Jake scratched his stubbled chin thoughtfully. "Wilson's place is clean and quiet. The widow Wilson runs a respectable house, no saloon attached, proper rooms with doors that lock. 2 blocks that way." He jerked his thumb toward the west end of the main street. "Perfect," Michael agreed. "We'll see to the horses ourselves if you don't mind." Once their mounts were properly cared for and their essential belongings collected from the saddlebags, they made their way to the boarding house Jake had recommended. The widow Wilson proved to be a no-nonsense woman of indeterminate age who looked Nora over with shrewd eyes before agreeing to provide rooms for the night. "Separate rooms," she emphasized firmly, directing her comment primarily at Drew and Michael. "This is a respectable establishment." "Of course, ma'am," Michael assured her with his most charming smile. "The lady is under our protection, nothing more." Mrs. Wilson seemed satisfied with this explanation and showed them to their rooms, a small but clean chamber for Nora and a shared room down the hall for the 2 men. After days of camping, the simple accommodation seemed luxurious to Nora, a real bed with clean linens, a washstand with actual hot water provided, even a small mirror hanging on the wall. "Take your time to refresh yourself," Michael suggested as they gathered in the hallway after inspecting their rooms. "I'll go to the fort and locate my friend, explain our situation. Drew can see about provisions for his return journey. We can meet for dinner in the boarding house dining room in 2 hours." The pragmatic division of tasks left no opportunity for Nora to speak privately with Drew, something she suspected Michael had arranged deliberately to give them both time to collect their thoughts. As the men departed on their respective errands, Nora retreated to her room, grateful for the chance to wash away the dust of travel and change into the one clean dress she had managed to pack in her haste to leave Silver Creek. The simple act of brushing her hair and arranging it more carefully than had been possible during their journey gave Nora time to consider what she would say to Drew when they finally had a moment alone. Their agreement still stood. She would continue to San Francisco, experience life there, and write to him in a month's time with her decision. But now that the moment of parting was upon them, she found herself questioning whether such an arrangement was truly necessary. Had she not already seen enough of Drew's character to know that he was a man of integrity and courage, someone who respected her as an equal despite their different backgrounds? And had she not already experienced enough of the life he led to understand its challenges and rewards? What would a month in San Francisco reveal that she didn't already know about her own heart? These questions occupied her mind as she made her final preparations and descended to the boarding house's small dining room at the appointed time. Drew and Michael were already there, both looking somewhat transformed by their own efforts to clean up after the journey. Drew in particular caught her attention. He had shaved and his hair was neatly combed, making him appear younger and somehow more vulnerable than the rugged mountain man she had come to know. "Nora," he said, rising as she entered the room. "You look," he hesitated, seemingly at a loss for words. "Civilized again," she suggested with a small smile, taking the seat he held for her. "Beautiful," Drew corrected quietly, his eyes conveying what his limited words could not. Michael cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "I've spoken with Captain Williams at the fort," he reported as they settled around the table. "He's agreed to provide an escort for the next stage of our journey. There's a patrol leaving for Fort Vancouver the day after tomorrow. We can travel with them." "That's good news," Drew said, though his tone lacked conviction. "You'll be well protected." "Indeed," Michael agreed, "and I have other news as well. There's a gentleman staying at the fort, a Mr. Lawrence from San Francisco. He's traveling home after business in Salt Lake City and will be joining the patrol. When I mentioned we were escorting a young lady to San Francisco, he very properly offered his assistance." "What sort of assistance?" Nora asked cautiously. "He has business connections with several steamship lines," Michael explained. "He's offered to arrange your passage from Portland to San Francisco once we reach Fort Vancouver, and to provide introductions to society there, should you wish them." Nora felt a flicker of unease at this development. While the practical assistance was welcome, the mention of introductions to society suggested assumptions about her situation and intentions that weren't necessarily accurate. "That's very kind," she said noncommittally. "Though I should tell him I already have connections in San Francisco. My aunt, Mrs. Eleanor Webster, resides there." Michael's eyebrows rose slightly. "The shipping magnate, that's your aunt?" Nora nodded, somewhat surprised at his recognition of the name. "My mother's sister." "Well, that certainly changes things," Michael said with a low whistle. "Eleanor Webster is well known even in these parts. Her ships carry much of the trade between San Francisco and the Northwest ports." Drew had been silent during this exchange, his expression thoughtful. "This Mr. Lawrence," he said finally, "what do you know of him?" Michael shrugged. "Only what Captain Williams told me. He's some kind of merchant or investor, well respected in San Francisco business circles. Travels frequently between California and the territorial capitals on various enterprises. Seems respectable enough." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Wilson with their dinner, a simple but hearty meal of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread that put their trail cooking to shame. As they ate, the discussion turned to more general topics, with Michael sharing news he had gathered at the fort about conditions farther west and recent developments in the territories. It was only after they had finished their meal and Mrs. Wilson had cleared away the dishes that Michael, with a discretion Nora hadn't expected, excused himself to check on the horses one more time before turning in, leaving her and Drew alone in the dining room. For a moment neither spoke, the weight of their imminent separation hanging between them. Finally, Drew broke the silence. "It seems your path to San Francisco is clearer than we expected," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Between Michael, the military escort, and now this Mr. Lawrence, you should reach your aunt safely." "Yes," Nora agreed, studying his face. "Does that ease your concerns about returning to your claim?" Drew hesitated, clearly weighing his words. "It should. Knowing you'll be well protected for the remainder of your journey is reassuring." "But," Nora prompted, sensing his reservation, But I find I'm reluctant to leave you in the care of strangers, regardless of their credentials, Drew admitted, meeting her eyes directly. It's not rational perhaps, but there it is. The simple honesty of his statement touched Nora deeply. I understand, she said softly. I find I'm equally reluctant to continue without you, even with all these arrangements in place. Drew leaned forward slightly, his gaze intent. Our agreement still stands, Nora. A month in San Francisco, time to consider what you truly want without the pressures of our current situation influencing your decision. And if I told you I already know what I want, Nora challenged gently. Drew's expression softened. I would say that certainty is a luxury that deserves to be tested against reality before final decisions are made. He reached across the table to take her hand briefly. If what we feel for each other is real and lasting, it will survive a month's separation and reflection. Nora knew there was wisdom in his position, however much her heart might wish for more immediate resolution. You're right, of course, she conceded. It's just that after everything we've been through together, returning to the conventional rules of society seems inadequate. There's nothing conventional about our situation, Drew pointed out with a small smile. Or about you, Nora McIntosh. I suspect you'll find ways to challenge those rules with or without my help. The faith in her ability to forge her own path, regardless of circumstance, was perhaps the greatest gift Drew had given her, beyond even the physical protection and practical assistance of their journey together. He had seen her strength and independence as virtues to be encouraged rather than flaws to be corrected, and that recognition had allowed her to believe in herself in ways she never had before. When will you leave? She asked, returning to the practical matters at hand. At first light tomorrow, Drew replied. The sooner I return to my claim, the better chance I have of securing it properly before Prescott finds a way to interfere. Nora nodded, understanding the necessity even as she regretted it. Will you write to me as well, not just wait for my letter after a month? Drew considered this, then nodded. I'll send word when I reach my cabin safely, and updates on the situation with the claim as things develop. Where should I address my letters? To my aunt's residence in San Francisco, Nora said, providing the address she had memorized from their correspondence. Even if I haven't arrived yet when your first letter comes, she'll hold it for me. As they finalized these practical arrangements, Nora felt both the sadness of impending separation and a curious sense of hope. They were no longer just a mountain man helping a young woman escape an unwanted marriage, but two people deliberately choosing to maintain a connection despite distance and circumstance, to explore the possibility of a shared future once current challenges had been resolved. When they finally rose to retire for the night, Drew walked Nora to the foot of the stairs that led to the boarding house's second floor. There, with the propriety expected in civilization but far from the freedom they had known in the wilderness, he took her hand briefly in his. Until we meet again, he said simply, his green eyes conveying what propriety prevented him from expressing more directly. Until then, Nora agreed, reluctantly withdrawing her hand and ascending the stairs. In her small room, as she prepared for bed, Nora found herself filled with conflicting emotions, sorrow at the parting that would come with dawn, gratitude for the journey they had shared, and a growing determination that their separation would be temporary. Whatever San Francisco might hold, she would face it with the same courage and clarity of purpose that Drew had shown her was possible, even in the most challenging circumstances. And in a month's time, she would write the letter that would determine whether their paths would converge once more, this time not by chance or necessity, but by deliberate choice. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with a hint of autumn in the air despite the summer date. Nora rose early, knowing Drew planned to depart at first light. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, hoping for a few moments with him before he left. The boarding house was quiet, most guests still asleep, but as Nora entered the small parlor off the main hallway, she found Drew already there, his saddlebags packed and ready by the door. He turned at her entrance, a mix of surprise and pleasure crossing his features. I didn't expect you to be up so early, he said softly, mindful of the sleeping house. I couldn't let you leave without saying goodbye properly, Nora replied, moving to stand before him. In the soft morning light filtering through the parlor's lace curtains, Drew looked both familiar and somehow different, the mountain man she had come to know so well, now standing amid the trappings of civilization like a wild creature momentarily contained. The contrast only emphasized what had drawn her to him from the beginning, his natural dignity and quiet strength that required no social validation. "I have something for you," Drew said after a moment, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small object wrapped in a handkerchief and handed it to her. Curious, Nora unwrapped it to reveal a small nugget of gold, polished to a warm glow and attached to a simple leather cord as a pendant. "It's from the first gold I found in the canyon," Drew explained. "Not the most recent discovery, but special to me. I've carried it as a kind of talisman these past years. I'd like you to have it now." The simple gift touched Nora deeply, not for its intrinsic value, but for what it represented, a piece of Drew's life and history, something that had been important to him that he now entrusted to her. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely, running her finger over the smooth surface of the gold, "but I can't take your talisman." "You're not taking it," Drew corrected gently. "I'm giving it to you. As a reminder of our agreement and of the choice that waits at the end of your month in San Francisco." Understanding the significance of the gesture, Nora nodded and slipped the leather cord over her head, tucking the gold nugget beneath the collar of her dress where it rested warm against her skin. "Thank you, I'll treasure it." "Michael will take good care of you for the remainder of the journey," Drew assured her, changing the subject as if the emotional weight of the moment was becoming too much for him. "And from what he says, this Mr. Lawrence seems well positioned to ensure your safe arrival in San Francisco." "I'm sure they will both be excellent escorts," Nora agreed, though she left unspoken her feeling that neither could replace what Drew had come to mean to her. A clock somewhere in the house chimed the hour and Drew glanced toward the window where the sky was lightening rapidly. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "I want to make good distance today while the weather holds." Nora nodded, fighting back the urge to ask him to stay longer. His claim needed protection and their agreement required separation and reflection. "Be careful," she said instead. "Prescott's men may still be watching the trails." "I'll take the less traveled routes," Drew assured her. "And I'm familiar enough with the country to avoid unwanted encounters." They stood facing each other, both aware that this was no ordinary farewell between travel companions. In the few short weeks since their first meeting in the mercantile, they had shared dangers and confidences that had forged a bond deeper than many lifelong acquaintances. "1 month," Nora said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "1 month," Drew agreed, "and then, whatever your decision, we'll both know we made it with clear heads and open eyes." In the quiet of the early morning, with the rest of the household still asleep, propriety seemed less constraining than it had the previous evening. Drew stepped forward, closing the distance between them and with gentle deliberation placed his hands on her shoulders. "May I?" he asked softly, his intention clear in his eyes. Nora nodded, her heart racing as Drew bent his head and touched his lips to hers in a kiss that was both tender and restrained, conveying affection and respect in equal measure. It was brief, too brief for Nora's liking, but in the context of their situation and surroundings, it was a bold statement of intent and feeling. When Drew stepped back, his eyes held a new warmth and certainty. "That," he said quietly, "is something to remember while we're apart." "It will be difficult to forget," Nora assured him, her cheeks flushed but her gaze steady. With visible reluctance, Drew collected his saddlebags and moved toward the door. "Michael will return from the fort later this morning. He'll introduce you to Captain Williams and Mr. Lawrence, make the arrangements for your continued journey." "I'll be fine," Nora promised. "Go safely and write as soon as you can." Drew nodded, his hand on the doorknob. "Until your letter, then." And with that he was gone, stepping out into the brightening morning. Nora moved to the window, watching as he strode purposefully toward the livery stable where his horse waited. He didn't look back and she was grateful for that small mercy. A backward glance might have broken her resolve to honor their agreement. As Drew disappeared from view, Nora touched the gold nugget hidden beneath her dress, a tangible reminder of the connection they shared and the promise of a decision still to come. Whatever the next month might bring, she would face it with the strength and clarity he had helped her discover within herself. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of introductions and preparations. Michael returned mid-morning to escort Nora to Fort Boise, where she was introduced to Captain Williams, a courteous officer of middle years who assured her of the Army's protection for the journey to Fort Vancouver. More significant was her introduction to Mr. Lawrence, the San Francisco merchant who would be traveling with them. He proved to be a polished gentleman in his early 40s, with silver threading his dark hair at the temples and an air of quiet confidence that spoke of success in his business ventures. His manners were impeccable as he greeted Nora, expressing his pleasure at making her acquaintance and his willingness to assist in any way possible with her journey. Mrs. Webster is a respected figure in San Francisco business circles, he remarked when Nora mentioned her destination and connection. I've had the pleasure of meeting her on several occasions, though I wasn't aware she had a niece. My mother was her younger sister, Nora explained. They maintained correspondence until my mother's passing, but distance and my father's preferences limited our family connections. Mr. Lawrence nodded understandingly. The frontier often separates families in ways beyond mere distance. But San Francisco will welcome you, Miss McIntosh. It's a city of new beginnings and opportunities for those with the courage to seize them, a place where a woman of your capabilities might find her own path. Nora thanked him, though her hand strayed unconsciously to the hidden warmth of the gold nugget against her skin. San Francisco might offer opportunities, but she suspected her definition of home had already been rewritten in a cabin miles away in the wilderness. The journey west with the military patrol was safe but arduous, lacking the intimate companionship she had shared with Drew. Mr. Lawrence proved a solicitous escort and, true to his word, facilitated her passage on a coastal steamer once they reached Fort Vancouver. San Francisco was everything Nora had imagined, bustling, noisy, fog-drenched, and vibrant. Her aunt, Eleanor Webster, welcomed her not as a poor relation but as a kindred spirit. Within weeks, Nora found herself immersed in her aunt's world of shipping manifests, trade negotiations, and the intoxicating freedom of a city where reinvention was the norm. She learned the business quickly, her sharp mind devouring the complexities of commerce that her father had always insisted were beyond a woman's understanding. She attended social gatherings where she was admired for her wit as much as her beauty. She had escaped the trap of a forced marriage and found the independence she had craved. Yet every evening as the fog rolled in through the Golden Gate, Nora found her thoughts drifting east, over the Sierra Nevada and across the vast basin to a mountain cabin where a solitary man worked a hidden claim. She wrote faithfully, her letters filled with descriptions of the city but underlined with a longing she couldn't quite disguise. Drew's letters came sporadically, carried by whatever travelers he could trust. They were brief but poignant, speaking of the changing seasons, the work on the claim, and the emptiness of the cabin without her presence. He mentioned little of the conflict with the Prescotts, but Nora read between the lines, the tense encounters, the legal maneuvering, the constant vigilance required to hold what was his. The month of reflection Drew had insisted upon stretched into 2, then 3. Nora told herself she was being sensible, ensuring her feelings were true. But deep down, she knew she was simply afraid that the magic of their time in the wilderness wouldn't survive the reality of a permanent choice. The deciding moment came in late November, with the arrival of a letter not from Drew but from Michael Sullivan. "He won't tell you," Michael wrote in his sprawling hand, "but things are getting dangerous. Prescott has hired men to survey the land bordering Drew's. There have been accidents. Drew is holding his own, but he's fighting a war on 2 fronts, the Prescotts by day and the silence of that cabin by night. He needs you, Nora. Not just to fight Prescott, but to remember what he's fighting for." Nora read the letter in her aunt's elegant parlor, surrounded by silk damask and mahogany. She looked at her reflection in the gilt mirror, a successful, independent woman of San Francisco society. Then she reached up and pulled the leather cord from beneath her dress, letting the rough gold nugget catch the light. It didn't match her silk gown. It didn't belong in this parlor, and neither, she realized with sudden, blinding clarity, did she. She found her aunt in the study. "I'm leaving," Nora announced, her voice steady. Eleanor looked up from her ledger, studying her niece with knowing eyes. "Back to Montana."
Yes.
"To the mountain man." "To my partner," Nora corrected. Eleanor smiled, closing the book. I wondered how long it would take. You have the Webster spirit, Nora. We don't settle for comfortable when we can have extraordinary. Take the sea star. She sails for Portland on the morning tide. The return journey was a race against the coming winter. Nora traveled by steamer, then stagecoach, and finally hired a horse in a small settlement near the border, pushing herself as hard as she had on that first desperate flight. She arrived in Silver Creek on a gray afternoon in December, the town hunkered down against the cold. She didn't go to her father's house. She rode straight through town, ignoring the stares and whispers, and turned onto the North Trail. The forest was silent under a blanket of snow as she guided her horse up the familiar path. When she reached the clearing, she stopped, her heart hammering. The cabin was there, smoke curling from the chimney. But there were other tracks in the snow, many of them. Nora dismounted and ran to the door, throwing it open. Drew was there, standing by the fireplace, rifle in hand. He spun around, his face haggard and tense, prepared for an attack. When he saw her, the rifle lowered slowly, and he stared as if seeing a ghost. "Nora," he whispered. "I tried to write," she said, breathless from the cold and the emotion, "but words weren't enough. I had to come." She crossed the room in 3 strides. Drew met her halfway, dropping the rifle to pull her into his arms with a desperation that told her everything she needed to know. He buried his face in her neck, holding her as if she were the only solid thing in a crumbling world. "I thought I'd lost you," he murmured. "I thought you'd chosen the city." "I chose my home," she wept. "I chose you." They were married 3 days later by a circuit preacher in the cabin, with Michael Sullivan as their witness. It was a simple ceremony, far from the society wedding her father had planned, but infinite in its joy. The battle with the Prescotts ended not with a gunfight, but with a revelation. When spring came, Drew took the accumulated gold from his hidden claim, a fortune far greater than anyone in town suspected, and bought the Prescotts out. He purchased the surrounding land, the mining rights, and even the mortgage on the bank itself through an agent in San Francisco. When Nora finally walked into the mercantile to face her father, she did so not as a runaway daughter, but as the wife of the wealthiest man in the territory. "You threw your life away on a trapper," Harlan McIntosh sneered, looking at her simple clothes. "They're laughing at you, Nora. The whole town is laughing." Nora smiled, touching the gold nugget that still hung around her neck. She looked at her husband, who stood beside her, quiet, strong, and possessing a wealth that went far beyond the metal in the ground. "Let them laugh, father," she said softly. "They don't know the punchline." She took Drew's arm and turned to leave, walking out into the bright Montana sunshine. They laughed when she married a simple mountain man, it was true. But as Nora looked at the life they had built, the home in the mountains, the children who would grow up free, and the love that had weathered every storm, she knew who truly held the fortune. And it wasn't hidden anymore.